You think you know this man. You've seen the TV show. You've seen Forrest Whitaker playing him cool, dressed sharp, walking through Harlem like he owns every brick and every heartbeat of it. You've seen the movie references. You've heard the name dropped in rap songs. You've heard people call him a legend, a gangster, a godfather. And somewhere in your mind, you build a picture of Bumpy Johnson, a dangerous man, a street king, a criminal who ruled Harlem with fear and money and muscle. Here is the problem with that picture. Almost everything in it is wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not a little exaggerated. Fundamentally, deeply, deliberately wrong. And the people who got it wrong were not just making honest mistakes. Hollywood had a version of Bumpy Johnson that was sellable, that was exciting on screen, that fit a certain kind of story Americans are comfortable watching. A black gangster who is cool, but contained. Powerful, but ultimately controlled by the white power structures around him. Dangerous, but not too dangerous. Complex, but not so complex that it makes you uncomfortable. The real Bumpy Johnson made people very uncomfortable. Because the real Bumpy Johnson was a man who wrote poetry, who sat in his Harlem apartment reading Nietzsche and Shakespeare and Marcus Aurelius, who fed hundreds of poor Harlem families out of his own pocket when the city let them starve, who built a criminal empire not just through violence, but through an intelligence so sharp that even federal agents who spent years hunting him admitted, privately, that they had never encountered a mind like his in the underworld, who went to Alcatraz, the most terrifying prison in American history, and came out more respected than when he went in, who had a relationship with the Italian mafia that was not one of submission, as Hollywood would have you believe, but of mutual, carefully negotiated power, who watched Harlem change around him, who watched a new generation bring heroin into the streets of the community he had spent decades protecting, and who was powerless to stop it, who died not in a hail of bullets, not in a prison cell, not broken and forgotten, but in a Harlem restaurant he loved, surrounded by the neighborhood that had been his entire world, with the respect of enemies and friends alike. That man never fully made it to your screen. This video is the story of the real Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, the man Harlem called Bumpy, the man the FBI called one of the most dangerous organized crime figures in the history of New York City, the man the poor of Harlem called their protector, the man whose wife called him the most complicated human being she ever loved, the man whose death in 1968 left a hole in Harlem that the neighborhood has never fully filled. By the time this video is over, you're going to see him completely differently. And you're going to be furious that nobody told you this story the right way until now. Let's go. Before we go any deeper into this story, I need to ask you something real quick. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city in the comments below and tell me what time it is there right now. Because this story reaches people all over the world if you love stories like this, real, deep, unfiltered history that Hollywood buried and the textbooks ignored. Hit that like button right now. Because it takes you 2 seconds and it tells the algorithm that this kind of truth-telling content deserves to be seen by more people. Share this video with one person who thinks they already know who Bumpy Johnson was. Because after they watch this, they're going to call you and say you changed how they see everything. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button. This channel is built for people who want the real story. Not the sanitized version. Not the Hollywood version. The real version. And we're just getting started. Now, let us go back to the beginning. All the way back to 1905. To a small house in Charleston, South Carolina. To a baby boy born on Halloween. To the beginning of one of the most extraordinary, most misunderstood, most important lives in 20th century American history. On October 31st, 1905, in the city of Charleston, South Carolina, a boy was born into a world that had already decided it did not want him to succeed. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. His parents named him with care, with hope, with the quiet dignity that black families in the American South carried like armor against a world designed to strip them of everything. His father, Reverend William Johnson, was a man of faith and principle. His mother, Margaret Moultrie Johnson, was a woman of deep strength. They had several children. They lived in a city that in 1905 was still deeply, violently segregated, where the memory of slavery was not even 40 years old, where black men and women navigated daily humiliations, legal oppression, and economic exclusion as simply the conditions of their existence. Charleston in 1905 was a city of contradictions. It was beautiful in the way that southern cities built on slave labor are beautiful. Grand architecture, cobblestone streets, the harbor glittering in the Carolina sun. And underneath all of that beauty was a system of racial hierarchy so rigid, so total, so embedded in every institution of life, that a black child born into it faced a wall in every direction they turned. Schools were underfunded and segregated. Legitimate employment for black men was confined to the lowest paying, most physically grueling work available. The legal system was an instrument of white control. Violence against black people was not punished. It was often rewarded. Into this world came Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, and almost immediately, the world gave him another reason to be marked. He was born with a pronounced bump at the base of his skull, a protrusion at the back of his head that was visible, that was physical, that set him apart from the other children around him before he even opened his mouth. Children are not kind of difference. They never have been. And young Ellsworth was teased, mocked, singled out in the particular vicious way that children single out anyone who looks different from the group. The nickname came early. Bumpy. It was not meant as a compliment. It was not meant as a term of endearment. It was a label that said, "You are different, you are marked, you are less than." What Bumpy Johnson did with that label is one of the most important things to understand about who he became. He did not hide from it. He did not try to pretend it did not exist. He did not break under the weight of it. He absorbed it. He made his own. He turned the thing that was supposed to diminish him into the thing that defined him. By the time he was a grown man running half of Harlem, nobody on earth called him Ellsworth. He was Bumpy, and that name did not mean weakness. It meant something that made grown men step back and reconsider what they were about to say. The psychology of this early experience matters enormously for understanding everything that came later. When you are told from childhood that you are marked, that you are different, that you are less, you have two paths. You can accept that verdict, or you can dedicate your entire existence to proving it wrong. Bumpy Johnson chose the second path with a ferocity that would take him from the back streets of Charleston all the way to the corridors of power of the American underworld. Something else happened to young Ellsworth Johnson in Charleston that Hollywood has almost entirely ignored. He fell in love with books. This is documented. This is confirmed by people who knew him throughout his life, from childhood acquaintances in Charleston to the federal agents who eventually hunted him in New York. Bumpy Johnson was a reader, not a casual, occasional reader, a voracious, obsessive, all-consuming reader who treated the written word as a lifeline and a weapon simultaneously. In 1905, in the segregated South, a black child's access to books was deliberately limited. Libraries were segregated or closed to black children entirely. Schools for black children were underfunded to the point of being almost deliberately useless. But knowledge has a way of finding the people who desperately need it. And Bumpy Johnson found books wherever he could. In churches, in the hands of educated members of the black community, through his father's religious texts, through any source available to him. He read philosophy. He read history. He read poetry. He read the Bible not as a passive religious text, but as literature, as philosophy, as a record of human struggle and power. He was fascinated by stories of people who built things in impossible circumstances, who found leverage against systems designed to crush them, who used their minds when their bodies are not enough. This intellectual hunger, this ferocious desire to understand the world at its deepest level, would become one of the defining characteristics of Bumpy Johnson's entire life. It made him different from the men around him in ways that were not always visible on the surface, but were felt by everyone who encountered him. He did not think the way ordinary street criminals thought. He did not react the way ordinary men reacted. He was always thinking 3 steps ahead, always reading the room, always understanding the forces at work in any situation at a level that most people could not even perceive. But in Charleston in 1905, all of that intelligence had no legitimate outlet. None. Zero. The doors that opened for brilliant white children. Universities, law firms, medical schools, government, business were locked for black children in the South. Locked by law, locked by custom, locked by violence. A black boy in Charleston could be as brilliant as Abraham Lincoln, and the world would offer him the same choices: agricultural labor, domestic service, or the church. This is not an excuse for what came later. It is a context. It is the context without which nothing about Bumpy Johnson makes any sense. When people dismiss him simply as a criminal, they are refusing to ask the question that actually matters. What does a society produce when it takes a brilliant human being and tells him that his brilliance has no legitimate home? Harlem would answer that question with absolute clarity. The story of Bumpy Johnson cannot be separated from one of the most important demographic events in American history, the Great Migration. Between approximately 1910 and 1970, roughly 6 million black Americans left the South and moved to cities in the North, Midwest, and West. They left for reasons that were both simple and devastating. They left because of the terror of Jim Crow laws. They left because of the constant threat of lynching, a real, documented, systematic form of racial murder that claimed thousands of black lives in the South, often publicly, often with official tolerance or active participation. They left because of sharecropping systems that were designed to keep black families in perpetual debt, in conditions that were effectively economic slavery, even after the legal end of chattel slavery. They left because they heard, through letters and newspapers and word of mouth, that the North was different, that in New York and Chicago and Detroit and Philadelphia, a black man could get a factory job, could live in a neighborhood without being terrorized, could walk down a street without having to step off the sidewalk for white passersby, could build something. It was not entirely true, of course. The North had its own racism, its own segregation, its own violence. But it was different, and different when you're living in terror feels like freedom. The Johnson family was part of this migration. The exact timing of when Bumpy went north varies slightly across historical accounts. But what is clear is that as a young man, in his teenage years, Ellsworth Johnson moved to Harlem, New York. His older sister, Mabel, was already there. She had made the move earlier, established herself in the neighborhood, and it was to her home that young Bumpy came when he arrived in New York City for the first time. Think about what that moment must have been like. A teenager from Charleston, South Carolina, a city that was beautiful but suffocating. That was his home, but also his cage, arriving in New York City in the 1920s. Stepping off a train at Penn Station or Grand Central into a city of a million sounds, a million people, a million possibilities, a million dangers. Harlem in the 1920s was unlike anywhere else on Earth. To understand Bumpy Johnson, you have to understand Harlem. Not the Harlem of today, not even the Harlem of the 1950s or 1960s. The Harlem of the 1920s. Because that was the world that received him, shaped him, and ultimately claimed him. Harlem in the 1920s was simultaneously the most alive and the most desperate neighborhood in America. On one level, it was the center of black American cultural life. The Harlem Renaissance was in full bloom, a flowering of black art, music, literature, and intellectual life that was producing some of the greatest creative work in American history. Langston Hughes was writing poetry in Harlem. Zora Neale Hurston was writing novels. Duke Ellington was playing at the Cotton Club. Louis Armstrong was transforming American music. Marcus Garvey was building the largest black political movement the country had ever seen, right there on 125th Street. Harlem was electric. It was alive with ideas, with music, with the particular energy of a community that had survived everything thrown at it and emerged not broken, but creative, not defeated, but defiant. On another level, Harlem was desperately, brutally poor. The same neighborhood where jazz clubs lit up the night also housed tens of thousands of black families crammed into apartments that landlords refused to maintain because they knew their tenants had nowhere else to go. The same streets where intellectuals debated Pan-Africanism and black liberation also had children going to bed hungry because their parents' wages, limited to the lowest paying jobs the economy offered black workers, could not stretch to cover rent and food simultaneously. Harlem's poverty was not a failure of its residents. It was a direct product of deliberate economic exclusion. Banks refused to give mortgages to black families. Employers refused to hire black workers for anything above the most menial positions. Unions, which were supposed to protect workers' rights, often excluded black members entirely. The Cotton Club, that famous symbol of Harlem's jazz era, did not even let black customers into the front door. The black musicians who made it famous had to enter through the back. White customers came uptown to enjoy black music and black artistry, then went home to their segregated neighborhoods having paid almost nothing for the experience. This was the world that young Ellsworth Johnson entered. A world of stunning beauty and devastating poverty. A world of extraordinary intellectual life and brutal economic exclusion. A world where being black and brilliant and ambitious meant that most of the doors were not just closed but locked, and the people behind them were not going to open them regardless of what you did or how hard you tried. It was also a world where another economy was being built. An underground economy. A shadow world that ran parallel to the legitimate economy and offered the people excluded from that legitimate economy a way to participate, to earn, to build. And at the center of that underground economy, in 1920s Harlem, was a game called the numbers. When Bumpy arrived in Harlem and settled with his sister Mabel, he found a neighborhood that was unlike anything Charleston had prepared him for. The energy alone must have been staggering. The constant noise of a city that never slept, the concentration of humanity in the streets, the presence of people from every background imaginable, the jazz drifting out of clubs at 3 in the morning, the street vendors, the preachers on corners, the political organizers handing out pamphlets, the numbers runners moving through crowds with small slips of paper. He was a teenager. He was physically slight, but mentally sharp. He was carrying the weight of a childhood, spent being told he was less than a young life spent in a society designed to confirm that verdict, and an intelligence that had been looking for a place to land for as long as he could remember. Harlem gave him a place to land, but not in any of the places that society would have approved of. The legitimate economy had almost nothing for young black men in 1920s Harlem. Factory jobs that existed in other parts of New York were often closed to black workers through union discrimination and employer racism. The professions law, medicine, academia were technically accessible to black men who could afford the education, but the path to that education was full of barriers that most families could not overcome. The church offered dignity, but not income, for everyone who needed it. What the streets offered was immediate. Numbers running. Small-time theft. Working for the men who were building the underground economy that actually worked in Harlem. And for a young man with Bumpy's combination of physical courage, strategic intelligence, and absolute refusal to accept the verdict that the legitimate world had rendered on him. The streets were not a descent. They were the only ladder available. His first arrest came when he was still a teenager. His early criminal record shows a young man finding his feet in a world where survival required transgression. But what separated Bumpy from most of the young men who made the same choices was what he brought to those choices. The reading, the thinking, the chess player's mind that was always calculating outcomes several moves ahead of everyone else in the room. His sister Mabel watched this with the anguish that only a sibling can feel. Loving someone completely and being unable to stop them from walking into danger. Mabel was a stabilizing force in Bumpy's early Harlem years. She provided him with a home, with connection, with someone who knew him before the streets knew him. Her influence, though it ultimately could not redirect him, gave him something that many men in his position did not have. A personal anchor, a reminder that he was more than what the streets were making of him. But Harlem had plans for Ellsworth Johnson, and those plans were about to become very large, very complicated, and very dangerous. Because someone was watching the young man with the bump on his head and the book under his arm and the ice-cold eyes that never showed fear. Someone was watching and thinking, this one is different. This one is exactly what I need. Her name was Stephanie St. Clair, and she was about to change everything. Before we talk about Bumpy Johnson's rise, we have to talk about Stephanie St. Clair. Because you cannot understand what Bumpy became without understanding the woman who first saw what he was capable of who gave him his platform, who taught him things about power that no street education could have provided. And because Stephanie St. Clair's story is itself one of the most astonishing stories in American criminal history, a story that Hollywood has treated as a supporting character in Bumpy's narrative, when the truth is that for a long stretch of time, she was the main event and Bumpy was the supporting player. Stephanie St. Clair was born around 1897. The exact date is somewhat uncertain, in either Martinique or Guadeloupe, islands in the French Caribbean. She was of mixed African and French heritage, educated, multilingual, and possessed of an absolutely ferocious ambition that had no legitimate outlet in any country she would ever live in. She immigrated to the United States around 1911, landing in New York. She spoke French. She was elegant. She was beautiful. She was also completely, utterly fearless in a way that was almost supernatural. She spent several years working and saving money in New York, doing legitimate work, accumulating capital. And by around 1923, she had saved approximately $10,000. A fortune by any standard of that era, particularly for a black immigrant woman who had arrived in America with nothing. And she took that $10,000 and she invested it in the one economic engine that Harlem had that was completely controlled by black people, the numbers game. Understand what the numbers game was and why it mattered so much. The numbers game, also called policy or the policy racket, was an illegal lottery that operated throughout black urban neighborhoods in America, particularly in Harlem. It was simple in its mechanics and profound in its economic importance. Every day, players would choose a 3-digit number from 000 to 999 and bet small amounts of money on it. The winning number each day was determined by the last 3 digits of a publicly verifiable number, most commonly the total amount bet at a racetrack, published in the newspaper or later other publicly available numerical sources. If your 3-digit number matched, you won. The payout odds were typically 600 to 1, which sounds generous until you realize that the true odds were 999 to 1, meaning the house retained a significant edge. But here is the thing that makes the numbers racket so important in the context of Harlem's history. For the black community in 1920s and 1930s New York, this was one of the only financial products available to them. Banks would not give them accounts or loans on fair terms. Investment opportunities were closed. Insurance companies charged them more for less coverage. The numbers game was the one place where a poor black family in Harlem could put 25 cents on a number and have a legitimate chance. Not a good chance, but a real chance of winning enough money to pay rent, to buy food, to handle an emergency. It was not just gambling. It was a shadow version of the financial services industry that the legitimate world refused to provide to black people. And at its peak, the numbers game in Harlem was generating millions of dollars per year. Some estimates place the total amount wagered in Harlem's numbers operations during the 1920s and 1930s at tens of millions of dollars annually. It employed hundreds of people. The runners who collected bets on street corners, the bankers who backed the payouts, the controllers who managed the accounting, the muscle that protected the operation from rivals and thieves. It was, by any meaningful measure, one of the largest businesses in Harlem. It was just completely illegal. Stephanie St. Clair understood this perfectly. She invested her $10,000 in becoming a numbers banker, one of the people who backed the payouts. She was extraordinarily good at it. She was meticulous with her accounting, ruthless in her business decisions, innovative in her operations, and absolutely fearless in her dealings with everyone from corrupt police officers to rival operators. By the late 1920s, she was running one of the most successful numbers operations in Harlem, controlling territory that generated significant weekly revenues. She had become, in the language of the street, the Madam Queen of Harlem, the Queen of Policy. She was also deeply political. Unlike many underworld figures who simply wanted to make money and be left alone, Stephanie St. Clair was engaged with the political life of Harlem in ways that were remarkable and sometimes dangerous. She took out newspaper advertisements exposing corrupt police officers who were shaking down Harlem's numbers operators. She worked with legal activists. She was connected to Marcus Garvey's movement and to other strands of black political consciousness in 1920s Harlem. She was not just a criminal. She was a black woman who was using every tool available to her, including the criminal economy, to build power and independence in a world that wanted her to have neither. When Stephanie St. Clair noticed Bumpy Johnson, she saw someone who reminded her of herself. Not in background. Their backgrounds were very different, but in the combination of qualities that she valued most: intelligence, fearlessness, and a strategic mind that went beyond the obvious. The circumstances of how Bumpy came to work for Stephanie St. Clair are not fully documented in a single source, but the historical record is consistent. In the late 1920s, Bumpy Johnson became her chief enforcer, the man she trusted with the physical protection of her operation and the enforcement of her authority in Harlem's underground. This role was not simply about violence, though it certainly included that. It was about presence, about reputation, about the particular kind of message that is sent not by what a man does in any given situation, but by what everyone around him believes he is capable of. Bumpy's reputation was already building on the streets of Harlem. He was known as someone who did not back down, who did not scare, who had a code that he followed with almost frightening consistency. He did not hurt innocent people. He did not brutalize the weak. But for anyone who came at the operation he was protecting, Bumpy Johnson was exactly as dangerous as they needed him to be. Working for St. Clair also gave Bumpy an education that no street could have provided on its own. He watched how she ran her organization. He watched how she thought about power. Not just immediate power, the power of having the biggest crew, but structural power, the power of understanding how systems work and how to position yourself within them. He watched her navigate the incredibly complex political terrain of Harlem's underground, where the relationships between numbers operators, police, politicians, and the emerging Italian-American organized crime structures were shifting constantly. He learned. He absorbed everything. Their relationship was professional, but it was also something more than professional. A mentorship in which both parties were clear about the respective roles, in which St. Clair was building someone who would eventually be capable of operating on his own, while Bumpy was learning everything he could from the most sophisticated operator in Harlem. Whether the relationship was ever romantic is a matter that various accounts treat differently, and it is not something the historical record has definitively established. What is established is that together, St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson controlled a significant portion of Harlem's numbers economy through the late 1920s and into the early 1930s. And that control was about to be tested in the most violent, consequential way possible. Because a man named Dutch Schultz had heard about the millions of dollars flowing through Harlem's numbers operations. And he wanted them. Arthur Simon Flegenheimer was born in 1902 in the Bronx, New York. He was the son of German-Jewish immigrants, grew up in poverty, entered street crime as a teenager, and by the late 1920s and early 1930s had become one of the most powerful and most feared organized crime figures in New York City. He called himself Dutch Schultz, and that name was known and feared in a very wide radius. Schultz was not like the other major organized crime figures of his era in one very important respect. He was genuinely, unsettlingly unpredictable. Most mob bosses of that period operated according to understood rules. There were protocols, there were negotiations, there were ways of doing business that kept the violence contained and the money flowing. Schultz often dispensed with the rules entirely. He was known for sudden, explosive violence that other gangsters found disturbing even by the standards of the world they operated in. He killed people who surprised him. He killed people who he suspected might betray him. He killed people for reasons that were not always apparent to anyone else. This unpredictability made him terrifying in a way that even purely brutal men were not. By the early 1930s, Dutch Schultz controlled the Bronx beer trade. This was the Prohibition era. Alcohol was illegal, which made it enormously profitable, had political connections in New York City government, and was generating millions of dollars annually from various illegal operations. And he looked at Harlem and saw the numbers game and thought, why am I not making that money? The answer, of course, was that the numbers game in Harlem was built, operated, and controlled by black organized crime figures, by Stephanie St. Clair and operators like her. And Dutch Schultz intended to change that. Starting around 1930 to 1931, Schultz began a systematic campaign to take over Harlem's numbers operations. The campaign was not subtle. It involved violence, intimidation, kidnapping numbers bankers, and forcing them at gunpoint to sign over their operations, killing those who refused to comply, destroying the livelihoods of runners and workers across the whole network. Schultz came into Harlem with the confidence of a man who had never encountered a black organized crime figure who would stand and fight back, and with the backing of resources that dwarfed anything the Harlem operators had at their disposal. Most of Harlem's numbers operators capitulated. They had no choice. Schultz's crew was too large, too well-armed, too connected to police through the corrupt Tammany Hall political machine that ran New York City at the time. When Dutch Schultz told you that your numbers bank now belonged to him, you either agreed or you died. It was that simple, and the bodies of the men who chose to fight back demonstrated the reality with brutal clarity. Almost all of them gave in. Stephanie St. Clair did not. What happened next is one of the most remarkable episodes in American criminal history, and it is almost completely unknown to the general public. Stephanie St. Clair refused Dutch Schultz. She looked at what he was doing, not just as a criminal threat to her business, but as a racial assault on the black community's only self-sufficient economic institution. And she said no. She mounted a resistance. She used her political connections, writing letters to newspapers and politicians about Schultz's campaign. She reached out to law enforcement, not to surrender her own operation, but to expose Schultz's reign of terror. And she told Bumpy Johnson, "We're not giving them anything." Bumpy Johnson responded to that instruction with everything he had. The war between Dutch Schultz and the Stephanie St. Clair operation, and specifically between Schultz's crew and Bumpy Johnson, lasted roughly 2 to 3 years, from approximately 1931 to 1935. It was not a war in the Hollywood sense of constant spectacular firefights. It was a grinding, dangerous, asymmetrical conflict in which a much smaller force with far fewer resources tried to hold territory against a vastly more powerful aggressor, while simultaneously trying to survive, to protect the people who worked for them, and to find leverage that could end the conflict without complete surrender. During this period, Bumpy Johnson was arrested multiple times. He served prison time, but the arrest did not break him, and they did not end the resistance. What they did was begin to build the criminal record that would follow him for the rest of his life, and the reputation that would eventually make his name synonymous with Harlem's underworld. Bumpy's tactics during the war with Schultz were notable for their intelligence. He understood that he could not beat Schultz in a direct confrontation. The numbers and resources were too unequal. But he could make controlling Harlem expensive for Schultz. He could ensure that Schultz's men were never comfortable in Harlem, never safe, never sure what was coming next. He could use the community, his deep connections with Harlem residents who had known him for years, who trusted him in ways they would never trust an outsider, as an intelligence network that Schultz could never penetrate. He could make the cost of the takeover high enough that Schultz might decide it was not worth it. This required a kind of courage that is hard to fully convey. Dutch Schultz was not someone you took on lightly. The men who had tried before Bumpy were dead or broken. Taking the position that Bumpy took, standing in the way of Dutch Schultz, was not brave in the casual, comfortable way that word is sometimes used. It was the kind of brave that means you genuinely accept that you might not survive what you're doing, and you do anyway. The war had victims. People on both sides were killed. The streets of Harlem were dangerous in ways that affected not just the combatants, but ordinary residents who had to navigate a neighborhood where violence could erupt unpredictably. This is a cost that has to be acknowledged honestly. The war that St. Clair and Bumpy fought was also, in a real sense, a war that Harlem's community paid a price for, regardless of who started it. But the war also had something that almost no previous conflict with Dutch Schultz had. An ending that was not a complete Schultz victory. Because in 1935, the problem of Dutch Schultz was solved in the most dramatic way possible, by someone else entirely. By 1935, Dutch Schultz had attracted the attention of Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey, who was building a case against him. Schultz, characteristically, responded to this threat in the most extreme way available to him. He proposed to the ruling council of New York's organized crime world, The commission, the body that had been established by Lucky Luciano to adjudicate disputes between the major crime families, that they authorized the assassination of Thomas Dewey. The commission said no. Killing a high-profile public prosecutor would bring a federal response so massive and so devastating that the entire organized crime structure of New York would be threatened. Schultz's proposal was not just reckless, it was existential madness. Schultz did not accept that answer. He reportedly told the commission that he was going to kill Dewey regardless of their decision. On October 23, 1935, Dutch Schultz was shot at the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey. He died the following day, October 24, 1935. The shooting was carried out by men associated with Murder Incorporated, the enforcement arm connected to the commission. The man credited with organizing the hit was Lepke Buckelter. Schultz died in the hospital, reportedly delirious and talking incoherently as the end approached. For Bumpy Johnson and Stephanie St. Clair, the death of Dutch Schultz was a seismic event. The man who had spent years trying to destroy everything they built was gone. The war was over. At least this war, the war with Schultz. But here is where the story becomes more complicated and where the real drama of Bumpy Johnson's life truly begins. Because with Dutch Schultz dead, his numbers operations in Harlem did not return to black control. They passed to the Italian-American Mafia, specifically to the Genovese crime family and their associates. And Bumpy Johnson now had to navigate a new power relationship, one that would define the rest of his career. The question was, what kind of relationship would it be? Before we move on, it is important to note something that your honest mentor must say clearly. Some accounts of the Schultz-Johnson conflict, particularly those that have circulated in popular culture, include details that are either exaggerated, unverifiable, or drawn from sources with an interest in mythology rather than accuracy. Some stories of specific violent incidents from this period have been repeated so many times that they have taken on a kind of documentary authority they do not deserve. Where specific incidents are described in this script, they are drawn from the most reliable available sources. Where the historical record is uncertain, that uncertainty is acknowledged. What is not in doubt is the broad outline. Stephanie St. Clair ran the numbers. Bumpy Johnson was her enforcer. Dutch Schultz tried to take their operation. They resisted, Schultz was killed by the mob, and the power landscape of Harlem's underworld was fundamentally transformed. Now let us talk about what Bumpy built in the years that followed. When Dutch Schultz died in October 1935, Harlem's underworld entered a period of extraordinary flux. The organization Schultz had built, his numbers operations, his crew, his territory, suddenly had no one at the top. And the Italian-American organized crime structure in New York, which had watched Schultz's Harlem operation with great interest, moved quickly to claim it. To understand what happened next, you need to understand the organized crime landscape of New York in 1935. The 5 Italian-American crime families that would come to define organized crime in New York for decades, the Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno families, were in various stages of their development. The dominant figure in this world was Charles Lucky Luciano, arguably the most important organized crime figure in American history, the man who had created the modern structure of the American Mafia, who had organized the commission, who had turned what had been a collection of feuding ethnic gangs into something resembling an actual organized criminal enterprise with rules, protocols, and a chain of command. Luciano and his associates, particularly the Genovese family and their allies, moved into the space left by Schultz's death and claimed control of the Harlem numbers operations. They had the muscle. They had the connections to the corrupt political and police structures that made operating in New York possible. They had the money to back it up. But they had a problem. They were not black. They did not live in Harlem. They did not know the community, did not understand the relationships, could not navigate the neighborhood the way it needed to be navigated to run a numbers operation effectively. The numbers game, remember, was built on community trust, on the runners who were neighbors, on the bankers who were known and trusted figures, on a whole network of relationships that could not simply be transplanted from one ethnic community to another. The Italian mob needed someone in Harlem who could be their interface with the community, who could manage the operations on the ground, who had the respect and the connections and the knowledge that the job required. There was really only one person in Harlem who fit that description: Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson. The arrangement that Bumpy Johnson made with the Italian-American Mafia, primarily with the Genovese family structure, in the years following Dutch Schultz's death, is one of the most debated and most misunderstood aspects of his story. Hollywood, particularly the Godfather of Harlem television series, presents this as a relationship of subordination. Bumpy as a capable but ultimately controlled figure working beneath the Italian mob structure, his power contingent on their approval. This is a significant distortion. The actual relationship, as described by scholars of organized crime history and by people with direct knowledge of the Harlem underworld of this period, was considerably more complex and considerably more equal than that. What Bumpy negotiated, and negotiation is the right word because this was a business arrangement between parties who each had something the other needed, was a structure in which he maintained control of the day-to-day operations in Harlem in exchange for a percentage of the revenues flowing upward to his Italian-American partners. He was not subordinate. He was a partner, a junior partner in some respects, a partner who operated under certain constraints, but a partner whose independence was real and whose authority within Harlem was not contingent on moment-by-moment approval from anyone outside it. When disputes arose, he was expected to manage them. When decisions needed to be made about Harlem, he made them. When someone crossed a line in his territory, the response was his to determine. This distinction matters enormously. It is the difference between a lackey and a power broker. And Bumpy Johnson was never a lackey. What he gave up in this arrangement was a cut of his revenues, money flowing to the Italian families as their portion of the partnership. What he got in return was the protection of the most powerful organized crime structure in New York, the backing that meant that any outside challenge to his control of Harlem would have to contend not just with Bumpy's crew, but with the resources of the families behind him. In a world where resources and backing determined survival, this was not nothing. This was everything. Was this arrangement perfect? No. Did it constrain him in certain ways? Yes. Was it a compromise with a power structure that was racially unjust in its own right? The Italian-American mob was not exactly a beacon of racial equality. Absolutely. But in the context of what was available, in the context of the choices that actually existed in 1935 Harlem for a black organized crime figure who wanted to maintain independent power, Bumpy Johnson made the deal that preserved the most autonomy and the most benefit for himself and, crucially, for the community he operated in. Through the late 1930s and into the 1940s, Bumpy Johnson built his operation into something that was genuinely extraordinary in its scope. The numbers operation that he ran, initially built on the infrastructure he had worked within under Stephanie St. Clair and then expanded under his own direction, became the backbone of a broader criminal enterprise. At its peak, his numbers operation was one of the largest in New York City. The specific revenue figures are difficult to verify with precision. This was, after all, a cash business that kept no public records. But historians and law enforcement account from the period suggest that the Harlem numbers operations that Bumpy controlled were generating hundreds of thousands of dollars per week at their height. Some estimates go higher. He also expanded into other areas. Loan sharking, lending money at high interest rates, a practice that served the same community that the banks refused to serve, became part of the operation. He had interests in Harlem businesses. He had relationships with gambling operations. He was connected to the broader economy of Harlem's underground in ways that made him the central figure in that economy rather than just a participant in it. His crew was not enormous by the standards of Italian-American organized crime. He did not have hundreds of soldiers and dozens of made men in a formal hierarchy. What he had was a smaller, tighter group of people who were extraordinarily loyal to him personally, who had been with him long enough to trust him completely, and who operated with a discipline and intelligence that reflected the standards he set. He did not want wild men. He wanted capable, controlled, smart people who could execute without creating unnecessary chaos. He also had something that money could not directly buy, but that was worth more than almost anything else in his world: the respect of Harlem itself. Here is one of the things that the TV show and the movies actually do partially get right about Bumpy Johnson: though they present it in a way that is both oversimplified and undercontextualized. He genuinely gave back to Harlem in material, documented ways. At Thanksgiving, he organized the distribution of food to Harlem's poorest families. Turkeys, food packages, supplies, these were distributed from his operation to people in the neighborhood who could not afford a proper meal. This was not a one-time event or a publicity stunt. It was an annual practice that Harlem residents remembered and talked about for decades afterward. Multiple accounts from people who were children in Harlem in the 1940s and 1950s include memories of Bumpy Johnson's Thanksgiving distributions, a detail so consistent across unrelated sources that it is not seriously disputed. He paid rent for families who were being evicted. When a family in his neighborhood faced eviction because they could not make their rent payment, something that happened with brutal frequency in Harlem, where poverty was structural and landlords were merciless, Bumpy would often cover the payment himself. This was documented in interviews with residents and in some court documents from cases in which his financial activities came under scrutiny. He invested in Harlem businesses. He supported black-owned enterprises in the neighborhood, providing capital or business in ways that helped keep those enterprises alive in an economic environment that was genuinely hostile to them. Now, this picture needs to be complicated. It cannot be left as a simple Robin Hood narrative, because it is not a simple Robin Hood narrative. The same man who gave turkeys to poor families was also running loan sharking operations that charged those same families crushing interest rates. The same man who paid rent for evicted families was also the man whose numbers operation extracted money from Harlem residents every single day, taking a cut of the bets of people who could ill afford to gamble. The same man who supported black businesses also used violence and intimidation in ways that hurt real people who crossed him. This is not a comfortable picture. It is an honest one. Bumpy Johnson was not a saint who happened to operate in the criminal world. He was a criminal who had genuine regard for his community and expressed that regard in real, material ways, while simultaneously running operations that extracted value from that same community. Both of these things were true at the same time, in the same man, and any portrait that presents only one side is a lie. What the community remembered, what the people who knew him said consistently in the decades after his death, is that compared to what came before and compared to what came after, Bumpy Johnson's stewardship of Harlem's underworld was the most community-conscious version of that stewardship they had ever seen. He was not the only option. He was the best option among genuinely bad options. And the people of Harlem made their own assessment of that fact in ways that persisted long after he was gone. Through all of this, the empire building, the community giving, the navigation of the Italian-American mob relationship, one constant in Bumpy Johnson's life was the attention of law enforcement. Federal agents, city police, prosecutors, the apparatus of law enforcement was consistently, persistently focused on Bumpy Johnson. Part of this was legitimate law enforcement. He was running major criminal operations, and it was the job of law enforcement to investigate and disrupt those operations. Part of it was the particular intensity with which law enforcement focused on black organized crime figures as compared with their Italian-American counterparts, an inconsistency that Bumpy himself was acutely aware of and vocal about. He was arrested multiple times through the 1930s and 1940s. He served time on narcotics charges. We will come to the complicated and important question of his actual relationship with the narcotics trade in a later section. He developed a familiarity with the inside of courtrooms and the inside of jail cells that no one would choose by preference, but that he navigated with characteristic self-possession. And then came the destination that would define the most difficult chapter of his life. The island. The prison that was its own myth. The place they sent people when they wanted them to disappear from the world entirely. Alcatraz. Before we get to the prison years, before we get to Alcatraz and what it meant, we need to stop. We need to slow down and spend real time with the man himself. Not the criminal, not the power broker, not the legend, but the actual human being. Because this is the section that makes Bumpy Johnson different from every other organized crime figure of his era. This is the section that Hollywood completely failed to capture. And this is the section that, if you take nothing else from this entire video, will change how you think about what kind of person Ellsworth Johnson actually was. Because he was something that almost nobody expected him to be. He was an intellectual. Bumpy Johnson wrote poetry. This is not a rumor. This is not an embellishment added by people who loved him. This is a documented, verified, confirmed fact about his life that is attested to by his wife, by people who knew him personally, and by the existence of his actual written work. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, the man who ran Harlem's underworld for decades, who faced down Dutch Schultz, who negotiated with the Italian mafia on equal terms, who went to Alcatraz and came back. That man went home at night and wrote poetry. His poetry dealt with themes of justice, of a human condition, of the particular pain and beauty of black life in America. The specific content and quality of his poetry is something that his widow Mamie Johnson described in interviews. She was his keeper of the flame in many ways, the person who understood his inner life better than anyone else, and who worked until her death to ensure that the real man was not completely buried by the myth. What the poetry reveals, when you understand the context in which it was written, is an inner life of extraordinary complexity. Here was a man who operated daily in an environment where violence was a tool, where power was maintained through fear as much as respect, where the calculations of survival required a kind of coldness that ordinary life does not demand. And then he went home and wrote about beauty, about grief, about the search for meaning, about God and justice and what human beings owed each other. These are not the preoccupations of a simple man. These are the preoccupations of someone who felt the weight of what he was doing and tried, in the private space of his own mind, to make sense of it. It is important to understand something about what poetry meant in the Black American tradition of the 1930s and 1940s. Poetry was not a passive academic exercise. In the tradition of Langston Hughes and Claude McKay and the poets of the Harlem Renaissance, poetry was a form of resistance, a form of bearing witness, a way of insisting on the full humanity of people the system was trying to reduce to less than human. When Bumpy Johnson wrote poetry, he was placing himself, consciously or not, in a tradition of black intellectual and artistic life that was itself a form of defiance. A gangster who writes poetry, a criminal who loves Shakespeare, a man who orders violence and then goes home and asks God what justice actually means. This is not a comfortable combination, but it is a human one. Bumpy Johnson was an avid chess player. Again, not a rumor, not an embellishment. This is confirmed by multiple accounts from people who knew him. Chess matters here not as a charming anecdote, but as a window into how his mind worked. Chess is a game about seeing ahead. It is about pattern recognition, about anticipating what your opponent will do before they do it, about sacrificing pieces strategically in order to achieve a larger objective, about patience. The patience to not react immediately, but to think through all the consequences before making a move. Every one of these qualities was central to how Bumpy Johnson operated in the criminal world. The federal agents who spent years trying to build cases against him repeatedly noted, in internal reports and in later interviews, that Bumpy was extraordinarily difficult to pin down precisely because he seemed to anticipate their moves. He did not make obvious mistakes. He did not react emotionally to pressure. He made careful, considered decisions that often seemed counterintuitive in a moment, but that revealed their logic over time. This was not luck or instinct. It was the product of a mind trained to think in exactly the way that chess demands. He was also known for his calm. In situations that would make most men panic, confrontations, arrests, moments of extreme danger, he remained composed. Not because he did not feel fear, but because he had trained himself through decades of discipline to not let what he felt determine what he did. The chess player's patience. The poet's awareness that this moment is part of a longer story. To understand Bumpy Johnson fully, you have to understand his marriage. And to understand his marriage, you have to understand Mamie Hatcher Johnson. Mamie Hatcher was a Harlem woman who became Bumpy Johnson's wife in 1948 after years of their knowing each other in Harlem's social world. She was educated, sharp, and possessed of a clarity about her husband that was almost unusual in its completeness. She loved him She understood him, and she was under absolutely no illusions about what he was or what his life involved. Their marriage was complicated by the obvious fact that her husband was one of the most hunted men in New York City, that his criminal activities meant periods of imprisonment that separated them for months and years at a time, and that the particular pressures of living as the wife of a major organized crime figure, the surveillance, the social ostracism from legitimate society, the constant awareness that every knock on the door could be law enforcement, would have broken most people. Mamie did not break. She was, by all accounts, a woman of extraordinary resilience who created a real home life for them despite everything working against it. She was also, crucially for our purposes, Bumpy's most articulate public champion after his death. She gave interviews. She spoke about who he really was. She pushed back against Hollywood's simplification of him with a specificity and a forcefulness that was remarkable. Her accounts of their domestic life are among the most revealing sources we have about Bumpy's inner world. She described a man who was gentle at home, who read constantly, who had genuine intellectual conversations about philosophy and history and poetry, who was present with his family in ways that men in his position rarely managed to be. She also described a man who carried the weight of his choices in ways that were not always visible on the surface, who was aware of the harm that the life he led caused, who struggled with the contradictions between his values and his actions, who was more reflective and more conflicted than anyone who knew only his public persona could have guessed. Their daughter added another dimension. The Bumpy that she knew was a father who tried, despite everything, to protect his child from the world he operated in. He did not want his daughter in the life. He did not want her to know, in any more detail than was unavoidable, what her father's work actually entailed. This protective instinct, this desire to shield the people he loved from the reality of what he was, is one of the most consistently noted aspects of his character by people who knew him. Bumpy Johnson moved in Harlem's social world in ways that connected him to figures that no simple criminal would have access to. His friendship with Billie Holiday is one of the best documented of these connections. Holiday, one of the greatest jazz singers in American history, a woman whose voice carried a pain and beauty that still stops people cold 70 years after she recorded it, was a Harlem figure in the years when Bumpy was at the height of his power, and they knew each other with the easy familiarity of people who have occupied the same world for a long time. The relationship was not romantic. Both were with other people, but it was genuine. They shared something about the particular experience of black brilliance contained within systems that wanted to crush it, and they recognized that shared experience in each other. He also knew and was respected by numerous figures in Harlem's political, cultural, and religious life. People who, in the public record, could not be seen to have close associations with organized crime, but who privately acknowledged the reality of who Bumpy Johnson was and what role he played in the community. Ministers who accepted his charitable donations. Community leaders who quietly acknowledged that his presence kept certain kinds of predatory crime, robbery, assault against ordinary residents, at lower levels than they might otherwise have been, because Bumpy did not permit random criminality in the territory he controlled. This last point deserves emphasis. One of the consistent accounts from people who lived in Harlem during Bumpy's era is that the neighborhood was, in certain respects, safer under his stewardship than it became after his control ended. This is not because he was a law enforcement official or because organized crime is actually good for communities. It is not. It is because Bumpy Johnson enforced a code of behavior within his territory that prohibited certain kinds of predatory crime against ordinary residents. Random robbery, violence against women, street crime that terrorized the community. These were not permitted in his territory, and the enforcement of that prohibition was real. This is one of the paradoxes of organized crime that is difficult for people raised on simple narratives to grapple with. In communities that are systematically underserved by legitimate law enforcement, as black communities in America have consistently been, organized crime figures sometimes fill a governance function that, while deeply problematic in its own right, provides a form of order that is at least partially preferable to complete lawlessness. This is not an argument for organized crime. is an honest description of a situation created by the failure of legitimate institutions. People who knew Bumpy Johnson well, his wife, his associates, people who spent real time with him, describe a man with a coherent, if unofficial, philosophy of life. He believed in loyalty above almost everything else. He had seen, in the criminal world, what happened when loyalty failed, the betrayals, the deaths, the collapsed operations. He maintained loyalty to his people with an almost religious consistency, and he expected it in return with equal consistency. Betrayal was the one thing he found almost impossible to forgive. He believed in a rough justice, that the strong had obligations to the weak, that power without responsibility was not power, but exploitation, that the people who lived in his world deserved someone who was looking out for them rather than simply using them. This belief expressed itself in the community giving, in the code of conduct he maintained in his territory, in the way he treated the people who worked for him. He had complicated views on religion. He was raised in a family with a minister father with deep roots in Black Protestant Christianity. But decades of operating in the criminal world, of seeing the gap between what powerful institutions, including the church, preached and what they practiced, had given him a faith that was private, personal, and skeptical of institutional religion, while remaining deeply connected to the spiritual tradition in which he had been raised. He believed, and this is perhaps the most painful thread of his philosophy to follow, that the system that had produced him was fundamentally unjust, not in a naive or simplistic way. He was too sophisticated to believe that any single reform would fix what was broken, but in a deep, historically grounded way. He understood that the America of his time had been built on the labor and suffering of people who looked like him, that it had denied those people the full fruits of their citizenship, and that the choices available to brilliant Black men and women of his generation were directly, causally connected to that historical injustice. He had made the choices he made not because he lacked the intelligence or character to make other choices, but because the other choices had not been offered to him with any seriousness. Whether that makes his choices right or wrong is a question you are entitled to your own answer to. It does make them human. It makes them understandable. And it makes this simple designation of criminal feel inadequate for a man whose life contained everything that word includes and also everything it leaves out. Before we go into the prison chapters of Bumpy Johnson's story, let me ask you something directly. Have you ever heard someone described as brilliant, truly, genuinely brilliant, and then watched the world systematically refuse to give that person anywhere to put their brilliance? Have you ever known someone whose potential was obvious, but whose options were not? Because that is the thread I want you to hold on to as we go through what the law did to Bumpy Johnson over the course of his life. Not to excuse it, but to understand it fully. The prison years are not a separate chapter in his story. They are woven through the whole thing. From his teenage years in Harlem to the last decade of his life, Bumpy Johnson was in and out of incarceration with a regularity that defines the term career criminal in the most literal sense. But what he did with those years, how he behaved inside, what he was when the doors opened and he came back out, tells you things about his character that the free years cannot fully reveal. Bumpy Johnson's arrest record began in the late 1920s and extended through the 1960s. Over the course of his adult life, he was arrested dozens of times. The charges range from weapons possession to narcotics violations to assault to various conspiracy charges. He served multiple prison sentences of varying lengths. It is important to understand the context of these arrests with some nuance. Law enforcement in New York City during Bumpy's era was deeply corrupt, particularly in its dealings with Harlem's Black community. The same police officers who arrested Bumpy Johnson and his associates for gambling operations were often taking payoffs from those same operations, or from competing operations, which created a dynamic in which arrests were sometimes tools of intercriminal competition as much as genuine law enforcement. Tammany Hall, the political machine that dominated New York City politics for much of this period, maintained relationships with organized crime that made the distinction between law enforcement and criminality porous in ways that the simple narrative of law versus crime completely obscures. This does not mean that Bumpy was innocent of the charges that resulted in convictions. He was not innocent, but it does mean that the process by which he was arrested, charged, tried, and imprisoned was not a clean, neutral application of the law. It was something messier, more political, and more racially inflected than that. What is consistent across all accounts of his arrests and imprisonments is his demeanor. Composed, calm, dignified. He did not beg. He did not cooperate with law enforcement by providing information on others. He maintained the code of silence that was fundamental to the world he operated in with an absoluteness that even his enemies respected. He went into those courtrooms and those prison cells with his head up, and he came out the same way. The most famous and most significant period of Bumpy Johnson's imprisonment was his time at the United States Penitentiary at Alcatraz Island. Alcatraz, the name itself carries weight. The prison built on a rock in San Francisco Bay, surrounded by cold water and currents that made escape essentially impossible, designed specifically for the most difficult, most dangerous, most incorrigible federal prisoners in the American system. The place they sent people when they wanted them truly contained, truly isolated, truly cut off from the world. Al Capone had been there. Machine Gun Kelly had been there. The list of men who went to Alcatraz reads like the roster of mid-20th century American crime, and it was considered, both by the people who ran it and by the people who feared it, as the end of the road. Bumpy Johnson was sent to Alcatraz. The specific dates of his Alcatraz incarceration are documented in federal records. He was there during the period when Alcatraz was at the height of its notoriety, when it was the most famous and most feared prison in the country, when its mere name was used as a threat by law enforcement, when men who had faced danger without flinching would find themselves shaken by the prospect of the island. What was Alcatraz actually like? The physical environment was designed for control. Cell blocks with individual cells barely large enough to turn around in. Extremely limited communication with the outside world. Letters were scrutinized, visits were infrequent and monitored. The constant sound of the bay, the water, the foghorns, the distant sounds of San Francisco that reminded the prisoners of a world they could not reach. The cold that came in off the Pacific, the damp that settled in the stone walls, the isolation that was as much psychological as it was physical. The prisoner population was the most dangerous in the federal system. The men in those cells had been sent there from other prisons because they were considered unmanageable elsewhere. And yet, paradoxically, Alcatraz maintained order not primarily through violence, though violence certainly occurred, but through absolute consistency of routine, absolute certainty of consequence, and the psychological weight of the place itself. Into this environment, Bumpy Johnson brought what he always brought: his mind, his books, and his absolute refusal to be broken. According to accounts of his time there, from fellow prisoners and from later interviews in which he referred to the period, he maintained his reading practice inside Alcatraz. He read, he thought, he played chess when chess was available. He conducted himself with the same dignity inside the island prison that he maintained everywhere else, and the effect on the population around him was the same effect he had everywhere: respect. Men in Alcatraz, hardened, dangerous men from every corner of the American criminal world, gave Bumpy Johnson respect. Not because he was the loudest or the most violent, but because they could read something in him that commanded it. The intelligence, the composure, the absolute certainty about who he was that no prison cell could touch. He also, in a way that speaks to the community relationships he had built, maintained his connections to Harlem while imprisoned. Letters flowed. Through intermediaries, through the loyalties he had built over decades, he remained a presence even when physically absent. His name continued to mean something in Harlem during his imprisonment in ways that demonstrated the depth of the relationships he had built. These were not relationships maintained by fear alone. Fear evaporates when the feared person is locked on an island in San Francisco Bay. What remained was genuine loyalty. Here is something that the myth of Bumpy Johnson as an all-powerful, permanently dominant figure tends to obscure. Every time he went to prison, things in Harlem changed. The power structure shifted. New players entered the space he left behind, and not all of those changes were good for the community. The periods of his imprisonment corresponded with increases in disorder in certain parts of Harlem. not in a simple, direct causation way, but in the way that any period of leadership vacuum in any organization creates instability. The code of conduct he maintained in his territory was not self-enforcing in his absence. The relationships he had built were personal relationships that did not automatically transfer to whoever was minding the shop while he was gone. This is important for understanding his returns to power. Each time he came back from prison, part of what he had to do was rebuild, reassert his presence, reestablish the relationships, restore the code. This was not a simple process. The underworld does not hold positions vacant while leaders serve time. It fills them with whoever is available and ambitious. And clearing those people back out when you return requires exactly the combination of capabilities, intelligence, reputation, force, and community trust that Bumpy Johnson possessed in unusual measure. His wife Mamie bore the brunt of his imprisonments in ways that the histories of this period often understate. She maintained the household. She raised their daughter. She navigated the social and economic pressures of being the wife of an imprisoned criminal in a community where that status carried complex meanings. Sympathy from some quarters, judgment from others, the constant surveillance of law enforcement who believed, not without reason, that she was a conduit of information and resources between her husband and his operation. Mamie Johnson's resilience during these periods is part of the real story of Bumpy Johnson that gets lost when the focus is entirely on him. Behind every period of his imprisonment was a woman holding the life he would return it together, with minimal resources and maximum determination. One of the most important and most disputed aspects of Bumpy Johnson's criminal career is his relationship with narcotics, specifically heroin. The official narrative, the one supported by his criminal convictions, is that Bumpy Johnson was involved in narcotics trafficking. He served time on narcotics-related charges. Federal law enforcement classified him as a major narcotics figure in Harlem. This isn't a record. The counter-narrative, one promoted by his wife, by some of his associates, and by aspects of his public persona that he cultivated deliberately, is that Bumpy Johnson was opposed to the heroin trade, that he refused to traffic in it because of what it was doing to the black community, that the narcotics charges against him were either inflated, partially fabricated, or the result of his proximity to the trade without direct participation in it. The truth, as best as it can be determined from available sources, is more nuanced than either narrative. It is clear that heroin arrived in Harlem in serious quantities in the late 1940s and early 1950s, and that it devastated the community in ways that were genuinely terrible, destroying families, killing young people, creating a cycle of addiction and crime that was qualitatively different from and more destructive than the numbers game. It is also clear that Bumpy Johnson was aware of this devastation and that his public statements about it were consistently negative. Whether he was personally involved in the heroin trade or whether his narcotics convictions reflected participation in a network that included heroin trafficking even if he was not the primary actor, this is a question the historical record does not resolve with complete clarity. What is clear is that his public position on heroin as destructive to the black community was consistent and appears to have been genuinely held. And what is equally clear is that the men who came after him, the generation of Harlem criminal figures who rose to prominence in the 1960s and beyond, did not share his apparent reluctance about the drug trade, with consequences for Harlem that were catastrophic. When Bumpy Johnson came out of his final significant prison term and returned to Harlem in the 1960s, he returned to a neighborhood that was in the process of being transformed in ways that made everything he had built feel precarious, and in ways that he was ultimately unable to reverse. The 1960s in America were a decade of seismic change. The civil rights movement was reshaping the political landscape of the country. Sit-ins, freedom rides, the March on Washington, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., the rise of the Black Power movement, the anti-Vietnam War protests, the counterculture. America in the 1960s was a society arguing, at maximum volume and sometimes with maximum violence, about what it was and what it was going to become. Harlem in the 1960s was at the center of this transformation in a specific local way. The political consciousness of a neighborhood was rising. The civil rights struggle was giving a new generation of Black Americans a language and a framework for understanding their situation that was different from the frameworks of previous generations. The quiet accommodation of Bumpy's generation, the pragmatic navigation of a racist system, the building of power within the constraints imposed by that system rather than the direct confrontation of those constraints, was starting to feel inadequate to young Harlem residents who had grown up in a different world and who had different expectations. And then there was heroin. By the time Bumpy returned to Harlem in the 1960s, heroin had been in the neighborhood for a decade and a half, and the damage was visible and devastating. Addicts on street corners, young men and women whose potential had been swallowed by a substance that was entering the community through networks that were in some cases connected to organized crime figures, including, the evidence suggests, some of the same Italian-American crime families that Bumpy had been in business with. This is a dimension of Bumpy Johnson's story that deserves direct engagement. The relationship between the organized crime structures he was part of and the heroin trade that was destroying Harlem. Whether Bumpy was directly involved in heroin trafficking or not, he was operating in a criminal ecosystem in which heroin trafficking was present and in which some of his business partners and associates were involved. The community he had spent decades claiming to protect was being eaten alive by a drug trade that was at least partially connected to the world he moved in, and he did not have the power to stop it. This is one of the great, painful ironies of his story. A man who maintained a code about protecting his community, who enforced that code with real consequences, who genuinely believed that his stewardship of Harlem's underworld was more protective of the neighborhood than any alternative available. That man came back in the 1960s and found a community being destroyed by forces that his world had helped unleash, and found himself unable to reverse the destruction. Frank Lucas is one of the most controversial figures connected to Bumpy Johnson's story, and getting the relationship right requires careful attention to what is verified versus what has been claimed. Frank Lucas was born in 1930 in La Grange, North Carolina. He came to New York City in the late 1940s and, by his own account, an account that needs to be treated with considerable caution, he eventually became Bumpy Johnson's driver, protege, and close associate. Lucas's story became nationally known through the 2007 film American Gangster, in which Denzel Washington played him as a criminal mastermind who built a heroin empire by sourcing directly from Southeast Asia, bypassing the traditional Italian-American mafia supply chain. The relationship between Frank Lucas and Bumpy Johnson is, to put it plainly, a matter where Lucas's accounts are the primary source, and Lucas has demonstrated across multiple interviews and accounts a considerable willingness to reshape his personal history in ways that serve his preferred narrative. He has told different versions of how close he was to Bumpy, of what Bumpy taught him, of how much time they spent together, in ways that are not entirely consistent across different tellings. What does appear to be true is that Frank Lucas knew Bumpy Johnson, that he was in Bumpy's orbit in Harlem in the 1950s and possibly 1960s, and that he regarded Bumpy as a figure of enormous significance and influence. Whether he was the driver and constant companion that his most dramatic accounts suggest, or a more peripheral figure who elevated the relationship in retrospect to legitimize his own criminal career through association with a legend. This is something the historical record does not definitively resolve. What is not in doubt is that Frank Lucas went on, after Bumpy Johnson's death, to build one of the most destructive drug operations in Harlem's history. The heroin he brought into the community, branded Blue Magic and celebrated in the film for its purity, killed people. It destroyed families. It was a plague, and Frank Lucas was one of its architects. The glamorization of this in the film American Gangster is something that members of Harlem's community and various historians have criticized specifically and correctly. The connection to Bumpy Johnson matters here, not because Bumpy was responsible for what Lucas did. He was not, but because the contrast between them illuminates something important. Bumpy Johnson, whatever his faults, maintained a code that included certain prohibitions. Frank Lucas, who claims to have learned from Bumpy, apparently did not absorb those prohibitions, or did not care about them. The difference between the community consciousness that Bumpy, however imperfectly, tried to maintain and the pure profit maximization that Lucas represented is the difference between a generation that had grown up in Harlem with genuine community roots and a generation that arrived in it as outsiders and had no such roots to constrain them. Here is something that almost no account of Bumpy Johnson's life deals with adequately. What did he make of the civil rights movement? Bumpy Johnson's adult life coincided with the most important period of Black American political history since Reconstruction. He was alive and active in Harlem when Marcus Garvey built his movement. He was in his prime during the years of the NAACP's legal campaign against segregation, culminating in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. He was still alive and operating when Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his speech at the March on Washington in 1963. He was alive when Malcolm X, also a Harlem figure, preached Black nationalism and self-determination on the corner of 116th Street. The relationship between organized crime and the civil rights movement in Black communities is a complicated one that mainstream histories tend to ignore. Some organized crime figures were actively hostile to the movement, seeing political agitation as disruptive to the business arrangements they had established with existing power structures. Others were more sympathetic, seeing the movement's goals as aligned with their own stated values: economic dignity and safety for Black people, even if the methods were completely different. Bumpy Johnson does not appear to have been publicly or prominently involved in the civil rights politics of his era. His position in the criminal world made public political involvement both complicated and risky. But the people who knew him suggest that he followed these developments with attention and that his sympathies were not with the power structures that the movement was fighting. A man who had spent his life navigating the racism of American institutions, who had been imprisoned by those institutions, who had watched the people he grew up with grind themselves down against the walls of systematic exclusion. That man did not need to be told that the system needed changing. He had known it all his life. What he seems to have believed, with the fatalism of someone who had seen too much, is that the changes the movement was fighting for would not come fast enough to matter for the people he knew, the people of his generation, who had already made the only choices their world offered them. In the final years of his life, Bumpy Johnson was in poor health. He had a serious heart condition, congestive heart failure, that his doctors had been treating for some time, and that was worsening through the mid-1960s. He was in his early 60s, old by the standards of men who had lived the life he had lived, carrying the physical consequences of decades of stress, imprisonment, violence, and the particular exhaustion of maintaining a high-stakes criminal operation in an environment that never offered peace. His wife Mamie watched his health deteriorate with the particular anguish of someone who had been through everything with a person and now watched the most ordinary of enemies, the body wearing out, doing what law enforcement and rival criminals had never managed to do. Despite his health, Bumpy did not retire. He continued to operate. He continued to appear in Harlem, to maintain his relationships, to be present in the neighborhood that had been his entire world. Whether this was stubbornness or loyalty, or simply an inability to imagine himself as anything other than what he had been for 40 years, probably all three, he kept going. And then came the day in July 1968 when the going stopped. On the evening of July 7th, 1968, Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson went to Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue in Harlem. Wells Restaurant was a Harlem institution, a place where the community gathered, where jazz musicians and numbers runners and church ladies and politicians all ate at neighboring tables in the particular democratic informality of a neighborhood restaurant that serves everyone. It was exactly the kind of place that Bumpy would have chosen for an ordinary evening, a place that was Harlem. He sat down. He ordered. He was among people he knew, in the neighborhood he had spent his entire adult life in the place that had been both his kingdom and his home. He suffered a massive heart attack. He died at Wells Restaurant in Harlem on July 7th, 1968. He was 62 years old. The manner of his death was, in its own way, consistent with the way he had lived. Not in a prison cell, though he had spent years in them, not in a hail of bullets, though he had lived in proximity to bullets for 4 decades. Not broken and forgotten in some institution. He died in public in Harlem, in a place he loved, surrounded by the neighborhood that had been everything to him. There is something almost deliberately fitting about it, as if even in death Bumpy Johnson insisted on being on his own terms. The response in Harlem to Bumpy Johnson's death was significant and genuine. This was not manufactured grief or the performance of community mourning. The reaction of Harlem residents to his death tells you something real about what he had meant to the neighborhood. People came to pay their respects in numbers that surprised observers who did not understand what he had been to the community. His funeral drew a crowd that reflected the breadth of his relationships. Not just criminal associates, but ordinary Harlem residents. People who had received his help over the years. People who had known him for decades and who felt his absence as a real loss. The tributes from people who knew him described a man whose loss left a genuine hole in the community. They spoke about his generosity, about his protection of the neighborhood, about his presence as a stabilizing force that, whatever its costs, had provided something that disappeared with him. What also disappeared with him was the particular version of organized crime that he represented. The version that maintained community ties, that operated according to a code that included community obligations, that was embedded in the neighborhood in a way that made it, paradoxically, more accountable to that neighborhood than the more purely transactional criminal operations that would follow him. In the years after Bumpy Johnson's death, the heroin epidemic in Harlem intensified catastrophically. The criminal figures who moved into the space he had occupied did not share his community consciousness. The neighborhood that had been the center of Black American cultural life in the 1920s entered the darkest period of its history in the 1970s, a period from which it would not fully emerge for decades. The connection between his death and Harlem's subsequent decline is not simple or direct. The forces that devastated Harlem in the 1970s, the heroin epidemic, the disinvestment, the urban crisis, were the result of forces far larger than any one man's presence or absence could have determined. But in the mythology of Harlem, in the way the neighborhood told its own history, the death of Bumpy Johnson marked an ending of something. An ending of an era that, for all its violence and criminality, had included something worth noting. Now that you know the real story, now that you have the actual facts, the actual complexity, the actual human being, let's go back to what Hollywood gave you and look at it clearly. Because it is not just wrong in the way that biopics are always slightly wrong, compressed timelines, composite characters, invented dialogue. It is wrong in ways that reveal something important about how American entertainment processes Black history and what that processing does to the truth. The television series Godfather of Harlem, which debuted in 2019 and has been renewed for multiple seasons, stars Forrest Whitaker as Bumpy Johnson and is set primarily in the 1960s, following Bumpy's return from prison and his efforts to reclaim control of Harlem in the face of the Italian-American mob. The show is produced with high production values, features impressive performances, and is genuinely entertaining television. It is also, at significant points, historical fiction dressed in historical clothing. The show takes real historical figures, Bumpy Johnson, Malcolm X, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., the heads of the Italian-American crime families, and puts them in situations and conversations that either did not happen or are significantly dramatized beyond what the historical record supports. The relationship between Bumpy and Malcolm X in the show, for example, is a dramatically invented connection that serves the narrative of the series, but does not reflect a documented close association between these two men and the historical record. Both were major Harlem figures in the 1960s, and they certainly knew of each other. But the specific dramatic interactions depicted in the show are creative invention. The show also presents the Italian mob relationship as consistently more subordinating of Bumpy than the actual historical record supports. This choice serves the drama. It creates conflict, it gives Bumpy an antagonist to overcome, it generates tension. But it flattens the actual complexity of the arrangement, which was more equal and more negotiated than the show depicts. What the show does well is capture certain aspects of the texture of Harlem in the 1960s. The political ferment, The music, the particular energy of the neighborhood at a moment of enormous historical change. And Forest Whitaker brings a genuine weight and intelligence to the role that reflects some of the real Bumpy's qualities. But the show is television drama. It needs conflict, it needs villains, it needs scenes that work dramatically, and these needs inevitably bend the historical truth into shapes that serve the narrative rather than the record. The key point is this. The show will tell you it is inspired by true events, and it is, but inspired by covers an enormous range of distance from the actual truth, and in the case of Godfather of Harlem, that distance is considerable. The 2007 film American Gangster, directed by Ridley Scott and starring Denzel Washington as Frank Lucas and Russell Crowe as the detective pursuing him, is a superb film. It is also a film that has done something very specific to the public understanding of Harlem's criminal history. It made Frank Lucas the definitive figure of that history in the popular imagination and relegated Bumpy Johnson to a supporting role in his own story. In the film, Bumpy Johnson appears in the opening scenes as a figure of the old order whose death in 1968 creates the opportunity for Frank Lucas to rise. He is played with dignity and presence, but he is the before, the predecessor whose passing makes the main story possible. Lucas is the main story. This framing reflects the film's source material and its narrative priorities. It is not dishonest in any deliberate way, but its effect has been to establish in popular culture a hierarchy in which Frank Lucas is the significant figure and Bumpy Johnson is the legend who came before him. This hierarchy inverts the historical reality. Bumpy Johnson's career spanned more decades, affected more lives, was more deeply embedded in Harlem's actual history, and was by almost any serious measure a more complex and more consequential story than Frank Lucas's, despite Lucas's cinematic appeal. There is also a question about the film's treatment of Frank Lucas that the real history demands we raise. American Gangster is, in significant ways, a film that glamorizes Lucas's criminal enterprise, his self-sufficiency, his business genius, his defiance of the Italian-American mafia's control of the drug supply chain. The film presents these as admirable qualities in a context where what was actually being self-sufficiently, ingeniously distributed was a drug that killed thousands of people and devastated a community. Members of Harlem's community, including law enforcement veterans and community activists, have spoken publicly about their discomfort with a film that makes a folk hero of someone whose product caused genuine mass destruction. Bumpy Johnson's legacy is complicated, but Frank Lucas's legacy is straightforwardly destructive in ways that American Gangster largely elides. The contrast between how the two men are treated by Hollywood tells you something about what Hollywood is looking for in a story. Not moral clarity, not historical accuracy, but cinematic appeal. In Frank Lucas, with his direct source drug model and his bold visual story, is cinematically appealing in ways that Bumpy Johnson's more nuanced, more embedded, more community-rooted story is not. Bumpy's wife, Mamie Johnson, was vocal, in the years after his death, about her dissatisfaction with how Hollywood treated her husband's legacy. She objected specifically to the reduction of a complex human being to a criminal archetype. She wanted people to know about the poetry, about the reading, about the community giving, about the man she knew at home, the man who had genuine intellectual depth and genuine moral wrestling and genuine love for her and for Harlem. She felt, with justification, that every time Hollywood touched the story, it flattened it into something that was easier to sell, but less true. That the Bumpy Johnson of the screen, even when played sympathetically, was missing the interior life that made the real man worth knowing. She was right, and the degree to which her voice was heard outside of specific biographical accounts and documentary work is itself a measure of how little interest there was in the complicated truth versus the sellable myth. Hollywood simplifies black historical figures for the same reason it simplifies all historical figures, amplified by additional factors specific to how black history is processed by an industry that has historically been controlled by people who are not black and whose understanding of black history is partial at best. Complex black historical figures, Figures who contain genuine moral ambiguity, who were simultaneously products of racist oppression and participants in systems that harmed other black people, who were brilliant in ways that challenge simple categorization, require audiences to hold multiple truths simultaneously. This is uncomfortable. It challenges the narrative convenience that commercial entertainment requires. The choice, usually, is to tip the complexity in one direction or the other. Either the figure becomes a villain whose violence and criminality are his defining characteristics, or he becomes a hero whose criminality is redeemed by his community consciousness and his resistance to white power structures. Both of these framings are distortions. The truth is that Bumpy Johnson was a human being who contained both and who cannot be fully understood through either alone. The danger of the myth, of both myths, the villain version and the hero version, is that it prevents the real conversation. The conversation about what it means for a society to systematically exclude its most brilliant citizens from legitimate paths to achievement and then criminalize the paths they find. The conversation about organized crime as a governance structure in communities that legitimate government fails. The conversation about how the same institutions that imprisoned Bumpy Johnson for running a numbers operation in Harlem were simultaneously tolerating far more destructive organized crime activities in white communities because those activities were controlled by people with better political connections. These conversations are not comfortable. They do not fit into 90 minutes of entertaining drama. And so Hollywood does not have them. And the real Bumpy Johnson, the complicated, brilliant, human, flawed, extraordinary real Bumpy Johnson, stays buried under the myth. Until now, we are getting near the end, but I need you to be fully present for this section because this is where everything we have covered becomes something more than history. This is where Bumpy Johnson's story stops being just a story about one man in one neighborhood in one era and becomes something that speaks directly to the world we are living in right now. Because the questions that Bumpy Johnson's life raises are not historical questions. They are alive. They are happening right now. And if you have been paying attention to this video, you already know what I am about to say. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born in 1905 in a country that had abolished slavery 40 years earlier, but had replaced it with a system of racial hierarchy so comprehensive that a black child's life chances were almost entirely determined by the circumstances of his birth, by the color of his skin, by the county he was born in, by the neighborhood he lived in. He was given intelligence, ambition, creativity, and drive in quantities that most people are never given. And he was given essentially nowhere legitimate to put them. He made the choices that were available to him. He built the things he could build in the spaces that were open to him. He maintained, imperfectly but genuinely, a code of conduct that included real obligations to the community around him. A code that most of the people who judged him from positions of comfort and privilege did not have to maintain under anything like the same conditions. His story is a direct, specific, personalized answer to the question that America has been avoiding since before it was a country. What do you do with brilliant, ambitious people when you close all the legitimate doors to their ambitions? What happens to the potential that you refuse to develop through legal channels? The answer, in Bumpy Johnson's case, was the creation of an extraordinary criminal enterprise run by an extraordinary human being who could have been, in a different world, something that served everyone rather than something that the law spent decades trying to destroy. The waste of that potential. Not the criminality, which is real, but the waste, the squandering of a mind and a will that could have built something magnificent if the conditions had allowed it, is one of the indictments of American history that Bumpy Johnson's life represents. This is not unique to Bumpy Johnson. This is a pattern. It has repeated across American history with a regularity that is not coincidental. When communities are systematically excluded from the legitimate economy, they build underground economies. When brilliant people are denied legitimate paths, they find illegitimate ones. When the law refuses to protect certain communities, those communities build their own protection, even when the protection available to them comes with costs that the communities themselves would not choose if genuinely free choices were available. Bumpy Johnson is not the hero of this story, but the story is not his fault. and understanding the difference between those two things is essential. Harlem today is a neighborhood in the middle of a transformation that is in some ways as dramatic as any it has previously experienced. Gentrification, the process by which wealthier, often whiter residents move into historically black neighborhoods and drive up property values and rents in ways that displace the original community, has reshaped large parts of Harlem in the decades since the 1990s. The neighborhood that Bumpy Johnson knew, the dense, alive, poor, culturally extraordinary black Harlem of the mid-20th century, still exists in the memory of longtime residents and in the physical fabric of certain streets, but it exists alongside a Harlem that is increasingly unrecognizable to the people who built it. Wells Restaurant, where Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, is gone. The specific businesses and institutions of his era are largely gone, but the streets remain, and in the oral history of Harlem, in the stories that older residents tell to younger ones, in the way the neighborhood remembers itself, Bumpy Johnson's name endures. His legacy in Harlem's oral history is complicated in the way that all real legacies are complicated. Some people remember him as a protector, the man who kept the worst predatory crime out of the neighborhood, who fed the hungry, who paid the rent. Some remember him as an exploiter, the man whose numbers operation extracted money from the poor, whose loan sharking operations trapped families in debt, whose world ultimately connected to the drug trade that devastated the community. Most who actually knew him, or who knew people who knew him, hold both of these at once. The wall murals, the references in conversation, the name that appears in accounts of Harlem's history. These are the physical traces of a man whose impact on his neighborhood was so deep and so lasting that 60 years after his death, it has not faded. One of the most visible ongoing dimensions of Bumpy Johnson's legacy is in hip-hop culture. Hip-hop was born in the Bronx in the 1970s, partly in communities that had been devastated by the same forces: urban disinvestment, the heroin epidemic, the collapse of community structures that had overwhelmed Harlem after Bumpy's death. It developed its own mythology of street figures, of men who had built power in the absence of legitimate opportunity, of a tradition of black resistance to economic exclusion that stretched back further than any living practitioner could fully see. Bumpy Johnson appears in this mythology with notable regularity. Harlem-based and New York-based artists in particular have referenced him as an ancestor figure, as a symbol of a particular kind of self-made black power, as a connection to a history that the mainstream does not acknowledge. The references are not always accurate in their historical specifics, but they are genuine in their intent to claim a lineage, to connect the present moment to a past that deserves recognition, to insist that the history of black Americans in the 20th century includes not only the recognized heroes of the civil rights tradition, but also the more complex, more compromised figures who built things in the spaces the heroes were not invited into. Hip-hop's embrace of the Bumpy Johnson mythology is itself an act of community memory, a refusal to let the story be completely claimed by Hollywood, an insistence that the people who actually lived in the neighborhoods have some say in how those neighborhoods are remembered. You have been with this story for a long time now, and I owe you my honest answer to the question that the whole story raises. Was Bumpy Johnson a hero or a villain? He was neither. He was a human being. He caused real harm. The numbers operation he ran extracted money from people who could not afford to lose it. The loan sharking trapped people in debt. The violence that his organization employed hurt real people. The criminal world he was part of, even at its most community conscious, was a world built on exploitation and force. These things are true and they matter. He also did real good. The food distributions, the rent payments, the protection of the neighborhood from predatory street crime, the community investment. These things are also true and they also matter. He was a product of a system that refused to give him anything legitimate. He was a genius who built what he could build in the only space available to him. He maintained a code of ethics that was, within its context, real, not perfect, not uncorrupted, but real. He loved his wife, his daughter, and his neighborhood with a genuineness that his criminal record does not erase. He was also, in the end, A man who lived his entire life on the wrong side of a line that society draws between the people it accepts and the people it discards. He crossed that line not because he was worse than the people on the right side of it, but because the people on the right side of it had better circumstances, better options, and the luxury of pretending that their own position had nothing to do with the conditions that produced someone like him. The lesson of Bumpy Johnson's life is not that crime pays. It does not. He died young, having spent years of his life in prison, having watched the community he loved be destroyed by forces he could not stop, having never lived a day of fully free life in a country that said it valued freedom above everything else. The lesson is that human beings are more than their worst choices. That history is shaped by more than the choices of individuals. It is shaped by the systems within which those individuals are forced to make their choices. That the story of a life cannot be adequately told by the criminal record or the Hollywood version or the legend or the myth. That it requires the full picture. The bump on the head, the books in the cell, the turkeys at Thanksgiving, the poetry in the apartment above Harlem, the chess games, the wife who loved him completely and knew him completely, the neighborhood that remembered him as theirs. Here is what I want you to take from this entire story. Somewhere in America right now, and in Britain, and in Pakistan, and in Nigeria, and in Brazil, and in the Philippines, and in every country on earth, there's a child who is as brilliant as Bumpy Johnson was, who has the same kind of mind, the same kind of potential, the same kind of fire. And that child is growing up in circumstances that, like the circumstances of 1905 Charleston or 1920s Harlem, have decided before he or she was born what they will and will not be allowed to become. What happens to that child depends on choices that are not theirs to make. Choices about resources, about education, about the distribution of opportunity, about whether the systems of power in their country include them or exclude them. If those choices go the wrong way, as they went the wrong way for Ellsworth Johnson, that brilliance does not disappear. It finds a home. But the home available to it when the legitimate doors are closed is a home that costs everyone. The child, the community, and the society that threw away what it could have had. Bumpy Johnson did not waste his potential. His potential was wasted for him by a system that saw a black boy with a bump on his head and decided he was less than what he was. That is the real story. That is the story Hollywood will never fully tell. That is the story you now know. We have covered the broad outlines of Bumpy Johnson's criminal empire, but to fully understand what he built, we need to go deeper into the actual mechanics of how it worked. Because the scale and complexity of what he constructed, without formal education in business management, without legal protections, without the institutional infrastructure that legitimate enterprises take for granted, was genuinely remarkable as an organizational achievement. The numbers operation was the foundation. At its operational peak in 1940s and 1950s, Bumpy's numbers network extended through significant portions of Harlem and into adjacent neighborhoods. The infrastructure of a numbers operation was more complex than most people realize. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the runners. These were the street-level workers, often ordinary Harlem residents who ran the numbers as a side income, collecting bets from regular customers on their blocks, in their buildings, from their neighbors. A successful runner in a busy location could collect from dozens to hundreds of customers each day, gathering their three-digit number selections and their small bets, typically ranging from a nickel or a dime up to $1 or more for more serious players. The runners knew their customers personally. This personal relationship was essential to the operation. Customers trusted their runner, and that trust was the foundation of the whole system. Above the runners were the controllers, who collected from multiple runners and managed the accounting. The controller's job was precise and demanding. They had to keep accurate records of every bet collected, track which customers had placed what bets, ensure that the money flowing upward matched the bets recorded, and manage the relationships with the runners under their supervision. A good controller was invaluable. A dishonest or careless controller could cost the operation significant money. Above the controllers were the bankers, the people who actually backed the payouts. This is where real capital was required. On any given day, the winning number would pay out at 600 to 1 odds on every bet placed on it. If a large number of players had bet on the winning number, the payout could be substantial. The banker had to have enough capital to cover any realistic payout scenario, which required maintaining significant cash reserves at all times. Bumpy Johnson operated at the banker level and above. He was the person or among the persons who backed the system and who managed the overall operation. His role required not just the personal qualities we have discussed, but genuine financial management capabilities, understanding cash flow, managing risk across the betting portfolio, ensuring that the operation remained profitable despite the inherent variability in which numbers came up on any given day. The corruption of law enforcement was also an operational requirement, not an optional extra. Police officers who were being paid to look the other way from the numbers operation needed to be managed. They needed to receive their payments reliably. They needed to be handled with a combination of financial inducement and implicit threat that kept them in line, and they needed to be monitored for any signs that they were about to switch sides or that new supervisors who had not yet been brought into the arrangement were creating complications. This management of corrupt relationships was itself a significant organizational task. The numbers operation also required dispute resolution. When players felt they had been cheated, when runners had arguments with customers, when controllers and runners had conflicts about money, someone had to adjudicate these disputes in a way that maintained confidence in the system. Bumpy served this function with a consistency and apparent fairness that contributed significantly to the reputation that made his operation more trusted than many competitors. Any account of how Bumpy Johnson maintained his operation for as long as he did has to include an honest discussion of his political connections, because without those connections, the operation could not have survived. New York City politics in the era of Bumpy Johnson's rise in prime was dominated by the Democratic political machine centered on Tammany Hall, the network of political clubs and elected officials that controlled city government, including the police department, through a combination of patronage, corruption, and genuine provision of services to immigrant and working-class communities. Tammany had relationships with organized crime that were deeply embedded and mutually beneficial. Organized crime provided money and votes. Tammany provided protection from aggressive law enforcement and access to city contracts and services. These relationships extended into Harlem through the black political apparatus that had developed there. The Democratic clubs in Harlem that were connected to the broader Tammany structure and that managed the relationship between Harlem's residents, including its underground economy and the city government. Bumpy Johnson had relationships with this political apparatus that were real and that provided him with meaningful protection against certain kinds of law enforcement attention. This does not mean he was completely protected. His multiple arrests and imprisonments demonstrate that clearly. But it does mean that his operation existed within a political context that was more tolerant of its existence than a simple law and order narrative would suggest. The same city government that periodically sent law enforcement after him also included officials who had ongoing relationships with people in his world and who had interests in maintaining those relationships. These political connections have been documented in various historical accounts of Harlem's political history, in academic studies of organized crime in New York, and in some of the prosecutorial records from cases involving Bumpy and his associates. They are not speculation. They are part of the documented reality of how New York City worked during the mid-20th century. We have discussed the code that Bumpy Johnson maintained in his territory as if it were a simple, clearly defined set of rules. In reality, it was something more organic and more contextual than that, a set of practices and expectations that reflected both his personal values and the organizational logic of his operation. The prohibition on random predatory crime against ordinary residents was real and enforced. This was not generosity, it was also organizational logic. A numbers operation depends on community trust. If residents of Harlem feared the people associated with Bumpy's operation, they would not place their bets with his runners, would not maintain the personal relationships that were the foundation of the business, would not provide the intelligence about police activity and competitive operators that kept the organization safe. The protection of ordinary residents was, simultaneously, a genuine value and a business necessity. These two things are not mutually exclusive. The code about dealing with rivals was also more specific than the general impression of organized crime violence would suggest. Bumpy Johnson did not pursue gratuitous violence. Conflicts with rival operators were handled according to a progression. First warning, then financial pressure, then escalation if necessary. The escalation to violence was a last resort rather than a first response, not out of squeamishness, but out of the understanding that unnecessary violence attracted law enforcement attention, disrupted business, and was expensive in every sense. The treatment of his own people, the runners, the controllers, the people who worked in the operation, was notably paternalistic but also genuinely supportive. He paid reliably. He did not steal from people who worked for him. He had a reputation for keeping his word in all his business dealings, including dealings with people who had no power to enforce anything against him if he chose to break his word. This reputation was valuable beyond any specific transaction. It was the foundation of trust that made building and maintaining the organization possible. We touched on Bumpy's intellectual life earlier, but let us go deeper because it is one of the most remarkable and most underappreciated aspects of who he was. His reading was not casual or ornamental. He read systematically, with the purpose of someone who was genuinely trying to understand the world rather than simply spending idle time. The range of his reading, confirmed across multiple sources, included philosophy, both Western and the philosophical traditions embedded in African American intellectual life, history, particularly the history of colonialism and its relationship to the position of Black Americans, literature, both the canonical European tradition and the Harlem Renaissance writers who were his contemporaries, and religious texts that went beyond the Christianity of his upbringing to include broader theological and philosophical investigation. Several people who knew him personally described conversations with him that were startling in their depth. Conversations that ranged across history, philosophy, literature, and current events with a facility and genuine engagement that was not expected from a man with his background and reputation. He was reportedly a formidable conversational partner who could hold his own with educated professionals across a wide range of subjects. His poetry writing appears to have been consistent throughout his adult life, not just in certain periods. The practice of writing, the discipline of it, the private space it created, the way it forced a different kind of thinking than the operational demands of running a criminal organization, seems to have been genuinely important to him as a way of maintaining contact with an inner life that the external demands of his world constantly threatened to overwhelm. His chess playing extended to genuine study of the game. Not just recreational play, but engagement with chess theory, with the analysis of famous games and positions, with the intellectual tradition of the game. People who played chess with him described an opponent who was not just instinctively good, but who had clearly thought deeply about the principles underlying the game. The parallel to his operational style is almost explicit. In chess, as in Harlem's underworld, he was always thinking multiple moves ahead, always playing for position rather than immediate tactical advantage, always patient in ways that his opponents often were not. Bumpy Johnson's relationship with religion deserves more detailed attention than it usually receives, because it was more complex and more central to his inner life than most accounts acknowledge. His father was a minister. He grew up in a world saturated with the Black Protestant Christian tradition. Its music, its language, its moral framework, its way of making meaning out of suffering. This tradition was the bedrock of his earliest understanding of what was right and wrong, what mattered and what did not, what human beings owed to God and to each other. But decades of living as he lived, in a world where the institutions that claim to represent those values, the church, the law, the government, consistently failed the people they claimed to serve, where the gap between professed moral values and actual institutional behavior was vast and impossible to miss, gave him a faith that was thoroughly tempered by experience. He retained a spiritual dimension to his inner life that his wife and close associates confirmed was genuine. But it was a spirituality that had little patience for institutional religion and considerable anger at the way Christianity, in particular, had been used throughout American history to justify the oppression of Black people. This is a complicated position, a man whose moral sensibility was deeply shaped by a religious tradition, who also recognized that tradition as having been weaponized against the community that tradition claimed to protect. The tension between those two things was one of the threads of his poetry, according to people familiar with his written work. He prayed. He believed in something, in a moral order to the universe, in the significance of individual conscience, in the idea that the choices you make have consequences beyond their immediate practical effects. But he held these beliefs not with the comfort of institutional faith, but with the searching, sometimes anguished quality of someone for whom faith has been earned through struggle rather than inherited through culture. The Federal Bureau of Investigation maintained extensive files on Bumpy Johnson over the course of his criminal career. These files, portions of which have been released under the Freedom of Information Act and are available to researchers, provide a picture of how federal law enforcement understood him and what they were actually able to build against him. What is striking about the FBI files, for those who expect them to contain the definitive portrait of a major organized crime figure, is their mixture of extensive surveillance documentation and significant gaps in what they could actually prove. The agents who worked on Bumpy Johnson cases clearly believed him to be significantly more powerful and more central to Harlem's organized crime than they were consistently able to demonstrate in court. The files document surveillance operations, tails, phone taps were legally authorized informant reports that attempted to map the full scope of his organization. They document his relationships with Italian-American organized crime figures. They describe the assessments of field agents about his character, his intelligence, and the particular difficulty of building cases against someone who was both careful in his operational security and deeply embedded in a community that was not going to cooperate with federal investigators. The files also document the frustration that law enforcement felt in dealing with him, a frustration that reflects genuine professional respect of a negative kind. You do not document someone's intelligence and caution as extensively as the FBI documented Bumpy Johnson's if you do not recognize that you are dealing with an extraordinary adversary. Some of the most interesting material in the FBI files is the assessment of his character by agents who spent years watching him. These assessments are not complimentary. Obviously, they're written by law enforcement officials about a major criminal target, but they reflect, in ways that are sometimes almost reluctant, the recognition that the man they were pursuing was not a simple criminal, but a complex figure operating according to principles that were internally consistent, even if those principles were not the law's principles. Let us get specific about the actual scale of the numbers operation, because vague references to millions of dollars do not fully convey what this meant in the context of 1940s and 1950s Harlem. Historical and law enforcement estimates of the annual revenues of Harlem's numbers operations during their peak period, roughly the 1930s through the 1950s, placed the total amount wagered in the neighborhood at somewhere between $15 million and $50 million per year, depending on the source and the methodology. These numbers need to be understood in the context of what money was worth in that era. Adjusting for inflation, the higher end of those estimates would represent something close to $500 million in current value. Not all of this went to Bumpy. He was one of several major operators in Harlem, and the Italian-American families took their cut on top of that. But even a significant fraction of those numbers represents an extraordinary amount of money flowing through his hands, requiring sophisticated financial management, significant capital reserves, and a level of organizational control that most legitimate businesses of similar scale would not have been able to achieve without formal management systems and legal frameworks. The number of people employed in the operation at its peak, runners, controllers, bankers, muscle, people who manage the corrupt relationships with police and politicians, has been estimated in the hundreds. This makes Bumpy Johnson's organization one of the larger employers in Harlem at certain points, a fact that underscores the economic significance of the numbers operation for the community and the complexity of the relationship between Harlem residents and the underground economy that Bumpy ran. We have discussed the community benefits of Bumpy's stewardship of Harlem's underworld. Fairness requires equally specific discussion of the costs. The numbers game, whatever its community significance, as the only financial product available to many Harlem residents, was also a mechanism of economic extraction. The house edge ensured that, in aggregate, the community lost money to the operation every single day. Poor families who could not afford to gamble placed bets because the potential payout represented a meaningful sum, and because the social ritual of the numbers, the daily choosing of numbers, the runner's visit, the shared hope and disappointment, was deeply embedded in community life. The mathematical certainty was that most of these bets would lose, and the aggregate effect was a transfer of wealth from Harlem's poorest residents to the numbers bankers who ran the operation. The loan sharking was worse. People who came to Bumpy's operation for loans when legitimate credit was unavailable paid interest rates that were crushing. When they could not pay, the enforcement of those debts could be brutal. The families that fell into debt to the loan sharks associated with his operation did not experience it as community support. They experienced it as another form of exploitation. The violence that maintained the operation, the enforcement actions against rivals, the management of disputes had effects that extended beyond the directly targeted individuals. People were hurt. People were killed. The fear that was a tool of organizational maintenance was real fear experienced by real people. The streets where that violence occurred were streets where other people lived, worked, and raised children, and those people had to navigate the dangers created by the operation, whether they had chosen to be part of it or not. These are not abstractions. They're the lived experience of the community that Bumpy both protected and exploited simultaneously. And any honest account of his legacy has to include them alongside the turkeys and the paid rents and the protection from street crime. This is the full picture, not the hero and not the villain. The full human being with the full accounting. To fully understand the significance of Bumpy Johnson's story, we need to place it in the broadest possible historical context, to see it not just as the story of one man, but as a chapter in the long, unfinished American story of race, power, and what happens when a society does not live up to its stated values. Bumpy Johnson was born 40 years after the end of the Civil War. His birth year of 1905 places him in the generation that was the first to grow up with no memory of slavery. Children whose parents or grandparents had been enslaved, who were themselves technically free, but who lived in a country that had, in the years since the end of Reconstruction in 1877, systematically dismantled most of the advances made by freed Black Americans and replaced them with a new system of racial control as comprehensive as anything that had preceded it. The period from 1877 to the civil rights victories of the 1960s, the era that historians call the Jim Crow era, was the context for the entirety of Bumpy Johnson's life. He was born into it, shaped by it, confined by it, and ultimately, like every Black American of his generation, defined his life in response to it. Everything about his choices makes more sense when you understand the world those choices were made in. One aspect of the numbers game that is important to understand more fully is its relationship to the idea of economic resistance. Stephanie St. Clair understood this explicitly and talked about it explicitly. The numbers operation was not just a business. It was a Black-controlled economic institution in a landscape where Black-controlled economic institutions were rare and were constantly attacked by white competitors and white-controlled legal systems. The Italian-American mob's attempt to take over Harlem's numbers under Dutch Schultz was not just a criminal territorial dispute. It was an attempt by a white criminal organization to seize control of the one economic institution in Harlem that Black people had built for themselves and controlled. Bumpy Johnson's resistance to Schultz, and later his navigation of the Italian-American mob relationship in a way that preserved significant Black control over the Harlem numbers, was, from this perspective, an act of economic nationalism as much as it was self-preservation. This is not to romanticize it. Economic nationalism has never required clean hands. But understanding the numbers game through the lens of economic sovereignty changes how you see what Bumpy Johnson was fighting for, and why the community that he operated in gave him the degree of support that it did. This analysis is not unique to this video. It is the analysis of historians who have studied the period. Scholars like Cheryl Greenberg, whose work on African American economic life in Harlem during the Great Depression provides essential context for understanding the numbers game, and Shane White, who has written extensively about the policy game and its cultural and economic significance for the black community. The relationship between the New York Police Department and Bumpy Johnson was more complicated than either the law chasing the criminal or corrupt police protecting the criminal can fully capture. The reality included all of the following simultaneously. Individual officers who were receiving payments from Bumpy's operation in exchange for looking the other way. Other officers who were making genuine, good faith efforts to build cases against him. Department leadership that was at different times either genuinely committed to disrupting Harlem's numbers operations or captured by the political dynamics that made such disruption difficult or counterproductive in an institutional culture. In the NYPD that applied very different levels of enforcement energy to black organized crime and Italian-American organized crime, a disparity that Bumpy Johnson was aware of and vocal about. He pointed out, correctly, that the Italian-American crime families who were his business partners operated on a far larger scale, with far more violence, with far more corruption of public institutions than his operation did, and that they faced a fraction of the law enforcement pressure that he did. This was not paranoia or self-serving rationalization. It was accurate. The NYPD of Bumpy Johnson's era had deep, institutionalized relationships with Italian-American organized crime at the highest levels of the department, relationships that provided a degree of protection that black organized crime figures were never offered on comparable terms. This does not mean Bumpy was innocent or that the law enforcement attention he received was entirely illegitimate. But it does mean that the story of the law versus Bumpy Johnson was never as straightforward as the headlines made it appear. Harlem in Bumpy Johnson's era produced some of the most significant black political figures of the 20th century, and Bumpy's relationships with that political world were more extensive than is commonly known. Adam Clayton Powell Jr., the minister of Harlem's Abyssinian Baptist Church, and later a United States congressman from Harlem, was one of the most powerful black politicians in American history during his long tenure in Congress from 1945 to 1971. Powell was a complex figure himself, brilliant, flamboyant, genuinely committed to advancing black interests at the federal level, and simultaneously corrupt in his personal use of congressional resources. His relationship with Harlem's underworld, including with figures like Bumpy Johnson, was not documented in the public record with the specificity that would allow definitive claims, but the general overlap between Powell's political operation and Harlem's underground economy is something that historians of the period have noted. W.B. Du Bois, the great intellectual and civil rights leader, spent significant portions of his career in New York and was a defining figure of black intellectual life in the period overlapping with Bumpy's prime. While there is no documented personal connection between Du Bois and Bumpy Johnson, the intellectual tradition that Du Bois represented, the argument for the full inclusion of black Americans in American civic, economic, and intellectual life was the tradition that Bumpy's exclusion from legitimate society refuted in personal, daily, devastating terms. Marcus Garvey, whose Universal Negro Improvement Association was at its peak in Harlem in the early 1920s when Bumpy was arriving there, preached a doctrine of black economic self-sufficiency and Pan-African solidarity that had obvious resonance for anyone experiencing the economic exclusion of black Harlem. Garvey's movement collapsed in the late 1920s under legal pressure and internal divisions, but its ideas, the idea that black people needed to build their own economic institutions rather than waiting for inclusion in white-controlled ones, remain alive in Harlem for decades afterward. The numbers operation, in a distorted and ultimately harmful way, was the only available practical expression of that idea for many Harlem residents. One of the most important questions raised by Bumpy Johnson's story is the question of agency, of how much choice he actually had in the life he led. The structural argument says the system made him what he was. The racism, the economic exclusion, the denial of legitimate opportunity. These were the actual causes of his criminal career, and to treat him as simply an individual who made bad choices is to participate in the fiction that those choices were made in conditions of genuine freedom. The individual responsibility argument says millions of black Americans faced similar or worse conditions during the Jim Crow era and did not become criminal figures running major organized crime operations. The choices were constrained, yes, but they were still choices, and the consequences of those choices for himself, for his family, for the people who were harmed by his operation, were real. Both of these arguments have validity. The honest answer is that Bumpy Johnson had more agency than the purely structural argument acknowledges, and less agency than the purely individual responsibility argument assumes. He was a human being making choices within conditions he did not create and could not fully escape, with a moral seriousness that is visible in the way he lived and thought, even as those choices included genuine harms. This is not a comfortable conclusion. Comfort is not the point. Understanding is the point. And understanding Bumpy Johnson means accepting that his life was shaped by forces larger than himself, and simultaneously by the choices he made in response to those forces. That he was neither fully free nor fully determined, neither a pure victim nor a pure agent, but something that human beings actually are, complicated, constrained, capable of both great and terrible things, and worthy of the full accounting that he has, until now, rarely been given. We have discussed Stephanie St. Clair's role in building what Bumpy eventually inherited, but her story after the Dutch-Schultz War deserves its own attention, because it is as dramatic as anything in Bumpy's story. After Dutch Schultz's assassination in 1935, St. Clair sent a telegram to Schultz as he lay dying in the hospital. The telegram read, according to historical accounts, "As ye sow, so shall ye reap." This is the kind of act, bold, public, deliberate, that characterizes everything we know about Stephanie St. Clair. She had fought him for years. She had resisted when everyone else capitulated. And when he fell, she made sure the world knew she was still standing. In the late 1930s, St. Clair married Sufi Abdul Hamid, a black nationalist religious figure in Harlem who was known as the Black Hitler for his anti-Semitic views and confrontational tactics. The marriage was short and deeply troubled. Hamid was killed in 1938 in a plane crash, and St. Clair was convicted of shooting him before his death, though accounts of this episode are complex and disputed. She gradually withdrew from the numbers business in the 1940s, either through choice or circumstance, as the Italian-American families consolidated their control over Harlem's numbers through their arrangement with Bumpy. She lived until 1969, dying the year after Bumpy. One of the most extraordinary figures in the history of American organized crime, a black immigrant woman who built a financial empire in conditions that made such a thing nearly impossible, who faced down one of the most feared gangsters of her era, and who never, through any of it, stopped fighting. Her legacy is perhaps even more obscured than Bumpy's in the popular history, because the story of a black woman who built genuine independent power in a world controlled by men, criminal and otherwise, is even harder for the mainstream historical narrative to accommodate than the story of Bumpy Johnson. To fully understand Bumpy Johnson's position, it is worth spending a moment on the Italian-American families whose arrangement with him shaped the last 30 years of his career. The Genovese crime family, named for Vito Genovese, though the family's history is longer and more complex than any one leader, was the primary Italian-American organized crime entity with interests in Harlem through most of Bumpy's era. The family's interest in the Harlem numbers was primarily financial. It was a lucrative revenue stream that, once the arrangement with Bumpy was established, generated consistent income with relatively low direct operational involvement from the family. The relationship worked because both sides got what they needed. The Genovese family got money and a Harlem operation managed by someone who actually understood the community. Bumpy got the backing and protection of the most powerful criminal organization in New York City and, with it, the security to operate without constant challenges from rivals who might otherwise have tested him. What the arrangement did not give Bumpy was equality. He was a partner, not a member. He was not a made man, could not be a made man, because the Italian-American mafia structure of the era did not include non-Italian members regardless of their capabilities. His position was dependent on the continued willingness of the Italian families to maintain the arrangement, which gave them a form of leverage over him that he could not fully eliminate. This is one of the genuine constraints of his situation, and it is something he was clearly aware of. The intelligence and the strategic thinking he brought to everything else in his life was applied to managing this constraint as well. Maintaining his value to the arrangement, ensuring that his Italian partners had reasons to continue it, building enough independent community power that his position was not entirely dependent on their goodwill. The men who worked directly under Bumpy Johnson, the inner circle of his organization, are less documented in the historical record than he is, partly because they kept lower profiles deliberately, and partly because the historical interest in the organization has been predominantly focused on its leader. What we know from available sources is that his inner circle was small, carefully selected, and extraordinarily loyal. People who had worked with him for years and who had demonstrated both capability and trustworthiness through that sustained relationship. He did not bring in unknown quantities. He built his trust in people through extended exposure, and the people who made it into his inner circle had passed that test repeatedly. The crew was diverse in terms of background and function. There were people who managed the financial side of the operation, the counting, the record-keeping, the management of the cash flows that were the backbone of the business. There were people who managed the street operations, the runners, the controllers, the enforcement of the organization's presence in its territory. There were people who managed the political and police relationships, ensuring that the corrupted relationships were maintained and that any new law enforcement pressures were identified early. There were also people whose function was simply presence, who were known as Bumpy's people, whose proximity to him in public situations communicated the reality of his power without words needing to be spoken. Perhaps the most important and most overlooked participants in Bumpy Johnson's story are the hundreds of thousands of ordinary Harlem residents who were not part of his organization and did not choose to be part of his world, but whose lives were shaped by it in ways that range from genuinely beneficial to deeply harmful. The person who placed a 25-cent number bet every morning with the runner on their block was a participant in the system that Bumpy Johnson ran. They were not a criminal. They were doing something that millions of Americans did in one form or another, in conditions where the numbers game was one of the few financial products available to them. But their money flowed through a system that Bumpy controlled, contributing to revenues that funded both the community giving and the violence and the corruption that maintained the operation. The family that was saved from eviction because Bumpy paid their rent was a beneficiary of his power. So was the child on the street who was not targeted by predatory crime because Bumpy's code prohibited it in his territory. And also a victim, perhaps in other ways, perhaps the parent who lost money to the numbers, perhaps the neighbor whose family member got into debt with the loan sharks, perhaps someone who was in the vicinity of a violence that the operation generated. The complexity of Bumpy Johnson's impact on Harlem cannot be reduced to a single narrative for the simple reason that Harlem was made up of hundreds of thousands of individual human beings, and his impact on those individual human beings varied enormously depending on the circumstances of each person's relationship to his world. In the years immediately following Bumpy Johnson's death in 1968, Harlem entered the most catastrophic period of its history. The heroin epidemic that had been building for years exploded in the late 1960s and through the 1970s into a public health crisis of enormous proportions. Addiction rates in Harlem reached levels that were staggering. Young people, teenagers, young adults, who might in another era have been the next generation of the community's creative and economic life, were instead lost to addiction, to the crime that addiction drove, to the prison system that responded to addiction with criminalization rather than treatment, to the early deaths that heroin produced with terrible efficiency. The economic disinvestment that accompanied this crisis. Businesses leaving Harlem, residents who could afford to do so following them, property values collapsing, city services being cut, turned large sections of the neighborhood into something that contemporaneous observers compared to a war zone. Buildings were abandoned and burned. Blocks that had been full of life in the 1940s and 1950s became desolate. The political and institutional infrastructure that might have addressed this crisis was itself in various stages of dysfunction. The same Tammany machine that had provided a form of corrupt but functional governance to Harlem for decades had been broken by reform movements. The civil rights movement had achieved important legal victories, but the economic and social conditions of black communities remained devastating. Federal anti-poverty programs that had begun under the Johnson administration were being cut back under Nixon. Into this vacuum came the next generation of criminal figures. Figures who operated in Harlem's underworld without the community ties, without the code, without the particular combination of obligation and exploitation that had characterized Bumpy's stewardship. Frank Lucas's heroin operation was the most famous of these, but it was not the only one. The drug economy of 1970s Harlem was not organized in the way that the numbers economy had been organized. It was more fragmented, more violent, less concerned with community relations, and more purely oriented toward extraction. The contrast with the Bumpy Johnson era is not simply nostalgia or the distortion of memory that makes earlier times seem better than they were. Multiple community sources from Harlem confirm that the period after Bumpy's death felt different in ways that were specific and real, that the informal governance function his operation had performed, however imperfectly, had at least maintained certain minimum standards of community safety that disappeared with him. If the heroin epidemic of the 1970s was a catastrophe for Harlem, the crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s was worse. Crack cocaine arrived in Harlem in approximately 1985 and spread through the neighborhood with a speed and devastation that even the heroin epidemic had not matched. Crack was cheaper than powder cocaine, produced a faster and more intense high, was more physically addictive on shorter exposure, and drove crime rates in ways that transformed urban neighborhoods across America, including Harlem, into what felt to residents like active war zones. The criminal organizations that sold crack in Harlem were not organized crime in any meaningful sense of the term. They were fragmentary, violent, constantly warring with each other over territory in ways that produced street violence at levels the neighborhood had never seen. The code that Bumpy Johnson had maintained, the prohibition on random predatory crime against ordinary residents, was gone. Violence occurred in broad daylight. Children were caught in crossfire. The streets that had been alive with culture and community in the 1940s were now settings for a public health catastrophe that the city, the state, and the federal government were responding to primarily with mass incarceration rather than treatment or prevention. The mass incarceration that accompanied the crack epidemic had particularly devastating effects on black communities across America, including Harlem. Young men, primarily young black men, were incarcerated at rates that were, by any historical comparison, extraordinary. They left behind families that struggled in their absence, communities that were depleted of a generation of young people, and a cycle of poverty and incarceration that reproduced itself with terrible efficiency. Bumpy Johnson was not responsible for the crack epidemic. He died 17 years before it arrived in Harlem. But the trajectory from a numbers economy that he ran to the crack epidemic that devastated the neighborhood in the 1980s is a trajectory that cannot be entirely separated from the world that preceded it, from the failure of legitimate institutions to provide alternatives, from the criminal infrastructure that normalized certain forms of economic activity, from the political and legal responses that prioritized punishment over prevention. By the 1990s, Harlem had begun the slow, uneven, contested process of recovery. Crime rates fell dramatically as they fell across New York City following changes in policing, economic conditions, and a natural decline of the crack epidemic as it burned itself out. Investment began to return, cautiously at first, and then with increasing speed. New businesses opened. New residents arrived. The process of gentrification that would reshape the neighborhood began. The Harlem of the 2000s and 2010s was dramatically safer and more economically active than the Harlem of the 1970s and 1980s. It was also, in ways that longtime residents noted with complicated feelings, a neighborhood in which the community that had created its extraordinary culture, the community that had produced the Harlem Renaissance, that had made Harlem the center of Black American life in the 20th century, was being displaced by higher rents and changing demographics. The tension between recovery and displacement, between the genuine good of safer streets, better services, and economic activity, and the genuine loss of communities being priced out of the neighborhoods they created, is one that Harlem shares with gentrifying neighborhoods across America and around the world. It does not have an easy resolution. What remains of Bumpy Johnson's world in contemporary Harlem is primarily the memory, the oral history, the references in music and art, the knowledge carried by families who have been there long enough to remember. The physical structures of his world are mostly gone. The relationships that made it work are dissolved. But the name remains, and with the name, the complicated inheritance of everything he was. We have traveled an extraordinary distance together in this video. From a baby born on Halloween 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina, to a man who died in a Harlem restaurant 62 years later, having lived one of the most complex, most consequential, most human lives in the history of 20th century America. Let me do a final accounting. The things that are unambiguously true about Bumpy Johnson. He was born Ellsworth Raymond Johnson on October 31st, 1905, in Charleston, South Carolina, to Reverend William Johnson and Margaret Moultrie Johnson. He moved to Harlem as a young man, arriving into the extraordinary world of 1920s Harlem at a moment of both cultural flowering and devastating poverty. He worked with and for Stephanie St. Clair, the Queen of Numbers, becoming her chief enforcer and key operational figure. He helped resist the takeover of Harlem's numbers game by Dutch Schultz, a resistance that lasted years and that ended only with Schultz's assassination by the Mafia in 1935. He built, in the years following Schultz's death, one of the most significant criminal enterprises in New York City history, running numbers operations and other criminal activities in Harlem in a partnership arrangement with Italian-American organized crime families, primarily the Genovese structure. He was arrested multiple times, served multiple prison sentences, and was incarcerated at Alcatraz, the most feared federal prison of its era. He gave back to the Harlem community in material ways: food distributions, rent payments, business investment, that were documented and remembered by community members across decades. He maintained, in his territory, a code of conduct that provided certain protections to ordinary residents, even as his operation also harmed those same residents in other ways. He wrote poetry. He read voraciously. He played chess. He was, by all accounts of people who actually knew him, a man of genuine intellectual depth and moral seriousness who was completely and entirely capable of ordering and directing violence. He was married to Mamie Hatcher Johnson, who was his partner, his anchor, and his most articulate posthumous champion. He had a daughter whose protection from his world he tried, imperfectly, to maintain. He died on July 7th, 1968, of heart failure at Wells Restaurant in Harlem, at the age of 62. These are the facts, not the myth, not the Hollywood version. The facts, and now the assessment. Bumpy Johnson was not a good man in the simple sense that the word good is used in Sunday school lessons. His life caused real harm to real people. His organization extracted money from Harlem's poor, trapped people in debt, used violence as a tool, and was connected, however reluctantly on his part, to the narcotics trade that devastated the community he claimed to protect. He was also not simply a villain. His intelligence, his community commitment, his code, his love for his family, his intellectual life, his genuine desire to maintain something in Harlem that was worth protecting. These were real and they were significant. What he was, most accurately, was a human being of extraordinary capability who was born into extraordinary constraints and who responded to those constraints with everything he had, building the largest and most powerful thing available to him within the spaces those constraints left open. The tragedy of Bumpy Johnson is not that he failed. It is that he succeeded at something he should never have needed to build in the first place. That the talents that made him one of the most formidable organized crime figures in American history, the intelligence, the strategic thinking, the leadership, the community vision, were talents that, in a country that had actually meant what it said about freedom and opportunity, would have been channeled into something that served everyone rather than something that served some while harming others. That is the story Hollywood ignored. That is the story you now know. And that is the story that matters. You made it to the end. If you have been here this entire time, if you traveled from Charleston in 1905 to a Harlem restaurant in 1968, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. You do not want the easy version. You want the real one. And you earned it today. Now I need 3 things from you. First, drop a comment right now. Tell me what surprised you most about the real Bumpy Johnson story. Was it the poetry, the chess, the way he stood up to Dutch Schultz, the complexity of his relationship with the community, something about the way his world ended? Tell me. I read every single comment on this channel, and the conversations in the comment section are some of the best discussions happening anywhere on YouTube. Second, tell me whether you think Hollywood did him justice or buried him. This is a real question with real arguments on both sides, and I want to know what you think after watching this full story. Third, if this video gave you something, if you learned something, if it changed how you see this story, if it made you think about history or race or power or human complexity in a different way, share it. Share it with one person who thinks they already know this story. Share it with a friend who loves real history. Share it with anyone who cares about stories that go deeper than the surface. Like this video if you want more content like this. Subscribe to this channel if you are not subscribed yet, because we are not done. This channel goes deeper than mainstream media will go, tells stories that other channels are not telling, and does the research that the Hollywood version never bothered to do. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring about the real story. Thank you for giving your time to the truth. Bumpy Johnson deserved better than what Hollywood gave him. Today, with this video, we gave him something closer to what he actually deserved.